In June 2025, the world watched with bated breath as Israel and Iran clashed openly. Missiles streaking across the night sky, air defenses blazing, and civilians hiding in terror. From Israel's surprise attack on Iranian radar facilities at 3 a.m. to Iran's retaliatory missiles rocking Beersheba, both sides declared a fragile ceasefire on June 24th, but the uncertainty lingered like an echo in an empty room. The air was as tense as a string, choking every breath in a rapid rhythm. And suddenly, people remembered Gaza, a 100-kilometer strip of land that had been so quiet for so long that conflict had become routine, so normal that it was barely noticed. But Gaza wasn't always a name on a modern map. Its story began thousands of years before missiles and borders. Long before Palestine was whispered in the corridors of geopolitics, this narrow strip of coastline was shaped by Canaanite farmers, Philistine sea kings, Egyptian tax collectors, Babylonian conquerors, and Persian administrators. Layers of empire, belief, siege, calm, and oblivion are piled on top of each other in the sand like silent sediment. So tonight, let us step away from the fear and fury of modern headlines. Let us drift gently down those layers into a nameless Gaza shaped by ancient scribes, traded by sea kings, and etched in sandal footprints in the dust. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Segment 1. Empires Beneath the Sand, the first 3,000 years. Before maps were drawn, before nations named themselves, before the land was carved up by war or border, there was just coast and sky, wind and stone, and a place we now call Gaza. But back then it had no name. It was simply there, a sliver of fertile earth between sea and desert, kissed by salt wind, warmed by southern sun. The story begins in the deep stillness of time, when people first gathered along the shore, drawn by fish, by trade winds, by the promise of barley and olives and goats that could live on little. They settled near a bend in the dunes, building with mud brick and reed. They carved small hearts and smoothed their walls with hands calloused by work, but gentle in their shaping. They did not call themselves Canaanites. They were simply families, tribes, humans trying to live close to the rhythms of the land. And yet, in time, they became something more. The land of Canaan, stretching across hills and valleys in these coastal plains, was never truly united, but it pulsed with life, with city-states, shrines, clay tablets scratched with thoughts, markets filled with spices and cloth, and songs hummed softly as the sun fell behind the western sea. Gaza, even in those days, was not alone. It sat on ancient trade routes that moved copper from Sinai, oil from olive orchards, wine pressed from dusty grapes, and tales carried in leather sacks. It was a land of small kings and high gods, of sacred groves and open courtyards. Temples rose not to dominate but to serve, open to wind and light. Here, Baal was worshipped, god of storms and rain, his thunder both a threat and a blessing. Anat too was honored, fierce and strange, a goddess of love and war, her bronze figurines resting in quiet corners of homes now long gone. The people of early Gaza farmed the land in rows that curved like rivers. They pressed olives into oil by hand, baked bread in earth ovens, and painted pottery in swirls of red and black. Life was not easy, but was known, the kind of life that moves in cycles. Plant, harvest, trade, rest, and begin again. As centuries passed, Gaza's small villages grew into towns. Low stone walls began to define space. Courtyards filled with tools. Wells dug deeper. Storage jars multiplied. People began to gather not just for survival, but for craft, for ceremony, for community. A slow shift toward what we now call civilization. South of what is now Gaza City, a town emerged that would one day be forgotten, its name lost in dust. Walls rose in steady hands, thick enough to keep wind and beasts at bay. Lime-washed floors reflected the soft flicker of firelight. Narrow lanes curled through homes like veins. Children laughed in hidden corners. Goats stirred in shaded pens. The world was small, but full. Trade came next, as it always does. Boats with square sails passed the coast, stopping in the harbor's calm waters. From faraway lands came beads, bronze tools, new grains. From Gaza went fish, olive oil, sheep's wool. And alongside goods came ideas, strange stories, Foreign gods, new ways of counting, of carving, of speaking. The people of Gaza adapted, as they always would. They did not resist the world. They absorbed it. And in the middle of all this quiet flourishing, the Egyptians came. They did not arrive with thunder. At first, they came gently, merchants, emissaries, scribes. Then came the governors, the taxes, the small demand that turned into larger ones. Gaza, now part of a much wider realm, found itself under a distant crown. The pharaohs of Egypt placed their seal on tablets and expected tribute, grain, livestock, perhaps a few soldiers. And the people of Gaza complied, not with joy but with resignation. The wind still blew. The market still opened. Life, if watched from the rooftops, did not seem to change. But the details told a different story. Scarabs with hieroglyphs appeared in graves. Amulets shaped like Egyptian gods were worn beside local charms. Pottery shifted in form, becoming more standardized, less local. Language began to change. Even worship grew more complex. The people of Gaza did not lose themselves. They adapted, blended, endured. Still, the sea remained the same. The rhythm of tides kept time as empires rose and fell. Children were born under the same sky. Dates were picked from the same trees. Then came silence. Around 2250 BC, something shifted. The walls cracked. The streets emptied. Fire, perhaps. Famine, more likely. Or simply time and the slow crumbling that all cities face. Gaza's early towns fell quiet. The courtyards filled with sand. Roofs collapsed inward. No great battle is recorded, just absence. But silence is never forever. After some decades, people returned, whether they were the children of those who left or strangers drawn by the sea. We do not know, but they came. They swept aside the debris. They rebuilt walls. They redug wells. And life resumed, humble perhaps, but persistent. This is a heartbeat of Gaza's early story. Not glory or conquest, but endurance. Not fame, but presence. Always there, always adapting. Further inland, at a place we now call Tel El-Jul, new wealth glittered. Traders grew bold. Gold jewelry, delicate and ornate, began to pass from hand to hand. Diadems, amulets, rings with intricate carvings, signs of a new elite, of craftsmanship, of confidence. The town prospered, its walls strong, its markets busy. This was Gaza's golden moment. Not in the sense of empire, but in the small, radiant sense of daily peace. Here, on this dusty edge of sea and sand, people lived lives with rhythm. They walked familiar paths. They buried their dead with love. They whispered to their gods under starlit skies. And they waited for the next change. As always, the Canaanite age was not a single moment. It was a long, slow breath across centuries, marked by survival, by quiet flourishing, by the ability to bend without breaking. Gaza was not a capital. It was not a kingdom. It was something rarer, a place that stayed, that endured, that absorbed the storm, and learned to keep walking. Tonight, as you lie still, listening to hum of history, imagine those first families. Imagine their soft sandals on dry earth, their fingers in grain, their eyes watching ships on the horizon. They did not know their names would be forgotten, but they lived as if they mattered, and they did. Their traces remain beneath the streets of modern Gaza. Beneath the noise, the conflict, the grief, there is a stillness older than sorrow, a foundation deeper than destruction, a memory waiting in the dust. Let that memory cradle your thoughts. Let the slow rhythm of their lives become the rhythm of your breath. The wind still blows from the sea. The land remembers. And for now, you can rest. The sea has always brought change. Waves that shimmer under moonlight also carry wind-shredded sails and the hush of foreign tongues. One such wave arrived around 1200 BCE, but it was not made of water. It was made of people, tired, burned out, displaced. People in ships carved from timber, with hulls worn by salt and time. They did not come as tourists or emissaries. They came with families and fire, gods and goats, grain and iron. They came, perhaps not to conquer, but to survive. We now call them the Philistines. Long before the word Philistine became an insult in modern mouths, It was simply the name of a coastal people who settled here, in this land that would one day be Palestine. And among their first permanent strongholds was Gaza. Imagine now the coast, still wild, still open. The sky is heavy with salt and smoke. The Canaanite towns have begun to weaken. Walls crumble not from siege, but from time and weather and thinly stretched hands. And into this moment, the strangers arrive. Their ships anchor offshore. The tide pulls gently beneath their keels. And then a silence. Then paddles dip again. They row toward land. They are not a single tribe. Their origins blur, perhaps from the Aegean, from Crete, from Mycenaean kingdoms collapsing in fire. But their identity is not in where they came from. It is in what they brought. New weapons, new pots, new rhythms. They settle, not in haste, not in violence, but in need. They build, not cities of marble, but towns of compact homes and low courtyards, borrowing from what the Canaanites left behind. Some places they burn, others they inhabit. Some they simply live beside, merging slowly like watercolors on damp paper. And Gaza, once Canaanite, becomes one of their 5 great cities. Alongside Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, it forms part of a loose confederation, a network of cities that shared worship, trade, language, and politics. The Pentapolis, a 5-pointed shape on the sand. Gaza, now Palestine, begins a new life. In this new life, change is visible in small things. Pottery, once curved and red burnished, now bears sharp angles, black and red decorations, spirals, and birds drawn in confident lines. The pots are sturdier, better fired, and unmistakably foreign at first. But as time passes, the styles blend. Old and new begin to dance. A jug may bear Philistine shape, but be filled with Canaanite grain. In their worship, too, they carry fragments of the past. They bring gods from across the sea, Dagon, with his uncertain form half man, half mystery. Shrines rise in coastal cities, filled with altars and offerings, with incense rising into the wind. But these shrines are not palaces. They are not temples of imperial pomp. They are local, modest, built for everyday reverence. The Philistines do not write. Or if they do, the words are gone. What we know of them is told by others. Usually enemies, usually harsh. But archaeology speaks more gently. It tells of homes with hearths, of food cooked in pots not for kings but for children. It tells of loom weights and spindle whirls, of people who wove cloth while listening to the sea. It tells of life, not just war. Yet war, too, arrives. The Philistines expand inland. They clash with the highland tribes who will one day call themselves Israelites. The stories are remembered in sacred texts, in verses written long after the blood dried. David and Goliath, Samson and the temple, wars of turf and honor, stories shaped by memory and myth. But between the battles, there was still life. In Gaza, Philistine merchants sold oil and grain, linen and wool. Caravans moved down from inland towns, their wheels creaking across sand, bringing copper, timber, and rumor. At the harbor, ships set sail for Cyprus, Egypt, even distant Sicily. Gaza was no longer just a settlement. It was a node in a growing web, a place to trade, to listen, to wait. In the homes, families gathered on rooftops at dusk. Children played in the courtyards. Women ground grain on stone querns. Men repaired fishing nets or hammered metal over low fires. The air smelled of clay, sweat, and the sea. They were not conquerors anymore. They were home. And slowly, the Philistines became something else. They began to blend, intermarry, adapt. They borrowed language, customs, dress. Their foreignness faded like color in the sun. Within 2 centuries, they were no longer new. They were simply part of the land. But the world beyond them moved on. The great empires returned. Assyria to the north, Babylon to the east. They came not in ships, but in legions. Their messengers spoke of tribute, submission, and punishment. The Philistine cities, including Gaza, resisted briefly, then bent. In time, the name Philistine itself faded. The people remained, of course, but the identity dissolved. Gaza was still there. The courtyard still echoed. The wind still whispered. But the newcomers no longer asked who had first built the walls. They simply walked over them. And yet, somewhere beneath the dust of Gaza, Philistine hearts remain. Their pottery lies in shards below apartment blocks. Their footsteps, once pressed into wet clay, have hardened into silence. The story of the Philistines is not one of villainy or war. It is a story of arrival, of adaptation, of becoming local in a land that accepts, absorbs, and forgets. They came as strangers. They stayed as neighbors. They vanished as memory. And Gaza carried on. So as you lie still, let yourself imagine one of those early evenings. The sun has sunk low behind the sea. The air is warm, salted, still. In a small Philistine home, someone lights an oil lamp. The flame flickers. A clay jug sits by the door. A mother hums while kneading bread. A father sharpens a blade with quiet precision. A child leans against the threshold, watching the stars blink into being. Outside, the waves lap softly against the shore. History forgets names, but places remember lives. And Gaza, for all its scars, still remembers. Let the rhythm of waves carry you now. Let your breath follow the slow rise and fall of the tide. The strangers have arrived. They are no longer strangers. They are part of the land. And so are you. Sleep well. The wind shifts. Not all change arrives in waves or warships. Some changes slip in like perfume through linen. Some arrive on scrolls, not spears. Not every empire conquers with fire. Some do it with gold seals, feather quills, and quiet expectations. This is how Egypt came to Gaza. The Nile was far away, a world of green reeds and wide riverbanks, of stone temples and perfume-slicked priests. But the reach of Pharaoh stretched far beyond the pyramids. Across the sands, past the river Delta, past even the edge of memory, the kings of Egypt looked northward. And in time they saw Canaan. They saw Gaza. It was not the first time. Egypt had always looked beyond its borders with a wary eye and an eager hand. But something changed around 1500 BCE in the golden flush of the new kingdom. Pharaohs with double crowns, wrapped in lapis and linen, now dreamed not just a conquest, but a tribute. The land of Canaan was fertile, rich with olive oil and cedar, wine and wool. But more than that, it was a corridor, a thread through which Egypt could pass to the world beyond. The Hittites, the Assyrians, the trade ports of the north. Gaza, poised along this ancient road, was a knot in that thread. To control was not just to hold a town, but to possess a pulse point of the region's lifeblood. And so the scribes were dispatched. Not soldiers, not yet, not armies with bronze shields. No, first messengers with scrolls, couriers with tablets, letters carved in cuneiform, words sent from Pharaoh to the petty kings of Canaan. We call them the Amarna letters now, a collection of clay voices, dug up centuries later, still etched with a tremble of fear and obedience. The letters from Gaza's rulers were like whispers from a cracked doorway. To my Lord, my Son, my God, I fall at your feet 7 times and 7 times. They promised loyalty, promised tribute, promised grain, men, even their own daughters, and in return, Egypt sent statues, linen, tokens of approval, sometimes a troop or two, just enough to remind the little kings who they served. For a while, this was enough. Gaza became, in essence, a vassal, a loyal province. No rebellion, no fanfare, just the soft sounds of obligation. Taxes were collected not with swords, but with stamps. Granaries were counted, not looted. It was not peace exactly, but it was quiet. And in the stillness, Egypt expanded its roots. Egyptian governors were installed in key cities. It is possible Gaza hosted one of them, a man in fine robes with sharp reed pen, counting livestock and weighing jars of oil. Egyptian pottery began to appear in the homes of locals. Pale, delicate bowls, amphorae with rounded bellies, storage jars marked with hieroglyphs, symbols of distance, now brought near. In the cemeteries, the dead were buried with trinkets shaped like gods not native to this land. The Eye of Horus, scarabs molded from faience, amulets of Hathor, goddess of music and motherhood. These were not the old gods of Canaan. They came from the Nile, And yet here they were, tucked under pillows of dirt, beside skulls that had once whispered prayers in a different tongue. This was not forced conversion, not even conquest in the usual sense. It was something gentler and in many ways more lasting: assimilation. Egypt did not crush Gaza. It wrapped it, softly, like silk, but silk can strangle, too. There were benefits. Yes, roads were improved. Trade expanded. Gaza's harbor welcomed more ships, their sails bearing symbols from Egypt's heartland. Markets bustled. Coins, or rather, weighted pieces of silver, changed hands more frequently. Egyptian merchants bartered for local goods. Offerings scented oil, tools, and even cloth dyed in that unmistakable blue. The tribute system itself was complex and predictable. Each year, cities like Gaza would send delegations south, bearing gifts: timber from distant forests, barley packed in woven sacks, jars of honey sealed with wax. These offerings were symbolic, but they were also essential. They reminded the Pharaoh that Gaza remembered him, that it still bent the knee, and in return, the Pharaoh sent gifts of his own: robes of sheer linen, jewelry, perhaps even a finely carved box filled with cosmetics or ointments. These royal gifts were less about generosity and more about message. They said, "You are mine, and I have not forgotten." But not all was harmony. Beneath the calm, tension simmered. The local rulers, Canaanite elites still clinging to old identities, grew restless. They were kings in name only, their authority balanced on a reed thin enough to break with one stiff breeze. Their letters began to carry an edge. They complained of rebels, of rival cities, of needing more troops, more gifts, more acknowledgement. One letter from a nearby city begged, "Why have you not sent archers? They are burning the gates, and I am alone." The Pharaoh, far off in Thebes, may have read it, or maybe he did not. The empire was vast. Gaza was small, and so the cracks began. Outside the city, peasants still tilled the land. Shepherds still led goats along stone paths. But inside the city, things began to shift. The weight of tribute grew heavier. The people felt the cost. Taxes rose. Crops thinned. Frustration settled into the bones of ordinary life. Even so, the Egyptian presence lingered. They left behind more than pots and taxes. They left behind a way of life, a subtle rewiring of how time was measured, how rule was imagined, how power was adorned. For perhaps the first time, Gaza was being shaped not just by its geography, but by an idea of empire, of being a spoke in someone else's wheel. And still, life went on. Children played in courtyards, drawing birds in the dust. Women sang to infants in languages that bent and blended, part Canaanite, part something else. Merchants kept their records. Bakers tended ovens. The city breathed, even under the slow pressure of foreign expectation. But the pharaohs could not hold the world in their hands forever. In time, the Egyptian grip weakened. Distant wars, internal squabbles, shifting sands of politics. As the new kingdom entered its twilight, so too did its hold on Canaan. The tribute caravans grew less frequent. The letters stopped arriving. The governors disappeared. And Gaza found itself alone again, not in the sense of despair, but in the sense of release. Egypt had wrapped it gently. Now that wrapping fell away like linen on a breeze. And beneath it, Gaza remained. Changed, but still present. Still breathing. What lingered was subtle. A style of pottery, a fragment of language, a scarab buried in soil no one would till for centuries, the memory of an empire whispered in the shape of a street. It is strange to think how quietly empires end, not with fire, but with forgetting. The Egyptian rule over Gaza lasted roughly 3 centuries, a blink in the eye of eternity. Yet in that time, the city learned what it meant to belong to someone far away, to serve a master unseen, to trade autonomy for protection, to survive by offering pieces of itself. And perhaps that is a lesson that would return again and again in Gaza's long story. Tonight, as you lie still, think not of pharaohs in gold masks or towering obelisks. Think instead of a small room in Gaza, clay walls, a woven mat, a lamp burning low, A man counts grain owed to someone he has never met. A woman seals a jar of oil with care, knowing it will leave and never return. A child dreams of rivers he's never seen. This is what empires are built on. Not triumph, but transaction. Not glory, but habit. And now, the night deepens. Sometimes it marches, heavy feet on dry earth, spears upright in columns, chariots shaking the dust, trumpets, not a joy but warning. The Assyrians had arrived. After Egypt faded, Gaza stood exposed. Its thin walls weathered by time, its rulers uncertain, its people watchful. The tribute no longer went south to Thebes, but a habit of obedience remained. And just as the land began to remember its own voice, another shadow stretched across the horizon, this time from the northeast. The Assyrians did not write letters asking for loyalty. They wrote ultimatums. And when they were not obeyed, they wrote history with fire. From their capital cities along the Tigris, the kings of Assyria expanded with terrifying precision. Their armies were iron and order, siege engines taller than trees, bows that arch like the sky. Their scribes carved stories into stone of what happened to those who resisted, and most, understandably, chose not to resist. Gaza was one of them. There are no great battles recorded here, no epic defense, no siege song sung. Gaza, small and coastal, chose a quieter path. It offered tribute. It bent the knee, and in doing so, it was spared. But spared does not mean untouched. The Assyrians brought systems, governors, tax codes, inspections. They counted fields and livestock with icy attention. Local rulers became administrators, their authority balanced on scrolls from Nineveh. Assyrian scribes walked Gaza's streets, observing, recording, reminding everyone that the king who sat far away in a palace of carved stone was still watching. A sense of heaviness settled in. It was not just the taxes or the conscription of young men, or the fear of speaking out. It was a knowledge that everything, every olive pressed, every jar sold, every prayer whispered, existed under a shadow. And still, people endured, because they always do. Even under empire, life unfolds in patterns that empires cannot predict. Bakers still rose before dawn to heat their ovens. Children still played in alleyways. Lamps still flickered in the evening, casting warm circles of light onto walls painted with age. The city did not burn. It bent slightly and kept breathing. But the Assyrians, mighty as they were, did not last forever. Their empire stretched too far, demanded too much, and eventually collapsed under its own weight. When Nineveh fell in flames, it was not just a city that crumbled. It was a silence that echoed across the region. And from that silence, another voice rose. The Babylonians. Their arrival was not as sudden, not as brutal at first. They were heirs to Assyria's systems and ambitions, but they carried them with a different rhythm. Less thunder, more strategy. Less cruelty, more calculation. Yet Gaza, once again, found itself beneath a new name, a new power, a new distant king. By now, the people were used to it. The old patterns returned. Tribute changed hands. Local rulers changed titles. But the gaze of empire remained steady. Gaza's role was the same, to provide, to endure, to obey. And yet, something deeper shifted. The Babylonians came not just with armies, but with stories. With astrologers who read stars like scrolls, with scholars who counted the planets, recorded eclipses, mapped dreams. They brought tablets filled with mathematics and law codes and fragments of ancient myths. And slowly, the atmosphere changed. In some corners of Gaza, people began to see themselves not just as villagers under foreign rule, but as part of a larger world, a network of minds, of movements, of shared breath. But that world, too, trembled, because the Babylonians, for all their wisdom, were also warriors. Their most remembered act, the one that would echo through centuries, was the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of its people. Though Gaza did not suffer the same fate, it watched closely. It heard the cries of those driven from their homes. It saw the procession of captives. It witnessed the fragility of place, a belief of safety. It was a reminder. No wall is high enough, no loyalty deep enough. In the end, Empires do what they will, and the towns beneath them endure, or they do not. Still, Gaza survived. Its buildings may have changed shape. Its leaders may have learned to speak in new diplomatic tongues. But beneath the surface, the same old habits pulsed. The morning markets, the evening prayers, the quiet scraping of clay on a potter's wheel. And beneath that, the oldest layer of all, the will to remain. When we speak of conquest, we often imagine fire and sword. But most conquest is quieter. It settles into routines. It slips into language. It reshapes architecture and custom until the old ways are hidden beneath a thin dust of foreign rule. And so it was in Gaza. The Assyrians and Babylonians did not erase it. They added weight, added silence, but they could not make it disappear. If you could walk the streets of ancient Gaza in this era, you might see signs of both empires on the same corner. A scarab worn on a necklace, a wall painted with Mesopotamian symbols, a market that sells fish with Egyptian salt and Babylonian dates. It would feel familiar and foreign all at once. A city always in between. And in the homes, the people would still gather. They would eat bread made from barley grown in the same soil their ancestors had turned. They would sing songs passed down in quiet voices. They would tell stories, not of kings and empires, but their own grandparents, of storms survived, of harvest gathered just in time. History remembers the conquerors, but it is built by the conquered. And now, as you lie in bed, eyes growing heavier, imagine the soft lights of ancient Gaza flickering in the distance. Imagine the wind carrying scents of oil and herbs. Imagine the hush after curfew, the world still and breathing. In the corner of one home, a child stirs in sleep, wrapped in a woven blanket, unaware of the empire's reach. In another, a father looks out the door, watching the stars, wondering what language his grandchildren will speak. The Assyrians are gone. The Babylonians are fading, but Gaza is still here. And so are you. Breathe deeply. Let the weight of history settle, like sand around your feet. Nothing is permanent, but some things endure not in books, not in palaces, but in the quiet rhythm of life itself. Sleep now. The Persians are coming. But that story can wait. History, like the tide, sometimes recedes from violence. After the crashing storms of Assyria and Babylon, after the trembling of cities and the silence that follows siege, there sometimes comes a moment, not of peace, exactly, but of pause. And so it was in Gaza, as the torch passed once more. The Babylonian Empire had roared and burned and taken, but even its brilliance could not withstand the slow encircling of a greater power. From the highlands of Persia, beyond the Zagros Mountains, a new force emerged. Not all at once, not like thunder, but with patience, method, and certainty. Cyrus, king of Enchan, had already conquered the Medes. Now he looked westward, and Gaza, as always, stood along the path. The Persian Empire was not like the ones before. It did not press its weight with cruelty first. It ruled through roads and rhythm, coinage and tolerance. Where others built with fear, the Persians built with administration. Where others raised temples, they often let them stand. Cyrus came not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. And Gaza, now folded into this vast, ordered web, became part of something surprisingly calm. Gone were the iron fists of the Assyrians. Gone were the fiery punishments of Babylon. The Persians brought governors and satraps, yes, but they also brought a strange kind of permission. A soft, structured kind of control. The kind that let the city exhale. Let us imagine the city again. The sun rises over flat rooftops. Market stalls open slowly. There is no smell of ash, no soldiers marching in columns through narrow lanes. Instead, the scent of fresh bread and olive oil, salt from the sea, dust warmed by morning light. The people move with purpose, but not urgency. Persian scribes record harvest yields, but they do not bark orders. Local leaders still speak their language. Farmers still plant in familiar rows. The gods are still worshipped. Yahweh, Baal, Dagon. No shrines are burned. No altars overturned. This is something new. Empire without annihilation. Instead of crushing identities, the Persians collect them. Instead of replacing, they add. like pebbles in a mosaic. In Gaza, that means temples are allowed to breathe. Merchants are allowed to thrive. The long coastal road, the one stretching all the way from Susa to Memphis, runs right past Gaza's gates. Couriers pass through on swift horses. Traders arrive with goods from Anatolia, Persia, India. The world seems to pass through the city like wind through reeds. Coins begin to appear in Gaza's market stalls, stamped with the image of the great king, Darius, Xerxes. Not gods, not tyrants, just symbols of distant rule. Silver coin that carry not just value, but a message. You are part of something larger, and most people accept it, because life in this new empire is mostly predictable. You pay taxes, you serve when called, but you are left to live, to grow, to worship, to hope. The Persian rule lasts for nearly 2 centuries, and in that time, Gaza settles. The scars of earlier conquest begin to fade, not disappear, but soften. New layers of life cover the old. The walls are patched. The fields once trampled yield grain again. Families begin to think of the future, not just the surviving today. In the evenings, the city is quiet, flickering lamps in the doorways. The smell of lentils, cumin, wine. Somewhere, a child sings a lullaby in a language now long forgotten. Somewhere else, a man writes numbers on a wax tablet, counting jars of oil to be sent north. This is not peace as the poets imagine it, but it is peace enough. Let us sit with this feeling a little longer. Gaza, under Persian rule, is not famous. It does not make headlines in the histories. There are no great battles here, no tales of rebellion or inscribed glory. It is quiet, peripheral, almost forgotten, but that, in its own way, is sacred, because most of human history is not the story of kings or empires. It is a story of moments like this, when people are allowed to live without fear, when the sea is just a sea, when the road is just a path for trade, when the empire, distant and abstract, allows the city to belong to itself again. And Gaza, in these centuries, does just that. It becomes a city again, not a fortress, not a target, just a place to live. We know from fragments, pottery styles that shift subtly toward Persian norms, burial practices that mix older Canaanite tradition with Persian touches, a ring inscribed with name from far away. These are not symbols of conquest. They are footprints of contact, because the Persian world is vast, and Gaza is one of its many windows. Ships arrive in port bearing fabrics, spices, metals. Traders from Susa and Babylon, from Tyre and Sidon, pass through, eat meals, tell stories, sleep, and move on. And Gaza listens, watches, learns. It does not resist. It does not surrender. It simply absorbs. That is Gaza's ancient power, not dominance, but endurance. And in the slow movement of days and years, people build lives again. Imagine a home on the city's edge. Mud brick walls, a small courtyard, a fig tree in the corner, a father repairing a cracked jar, a mother teaching her daughter to spin wool, a breeze through the open window, the sound of sandals in the street. Somewhere far off, a flute. The empire is still there, of course. It always is. But for the first time in centuries, it does not press too hard. And that is enough. It is easy to forget how precious that is. To be left alone. To live without the whip, without the siege tower, without the fear of your city burning by morning. The Persians, in their wisdom or calculation, offered that for a time. And Gaza, ever watchful, accepted. But history is never still for long. Beyond the sea, new storms gather. A man is rising in Macedon. He dreams not of tribute, but of conquest. His name is Alexander, and soon his eyes will fall upon this coast. But not yet, for now the city sleeps. And so should you. Let your breath settle like dust on the courtyard floor. Let your thoughts drift like sails in calm water. The empire is quiet. The stars are steady. The wind smells of honey and smoke. You are safe. Gaza is safe. But only for a little while longer. The next chapter waits beyond the shore. Segment 2, Prophets and Powers. The religious pulse of a contested land. The land stirs again, not with conquest this time, but with whispers. Whispers carried on sandals and stories, in songs that speak of one God instead of many. The soil of Gaza has known many voices. Prayers once rose to Baal and Dagon, to storm gods and sea spirits, to mother goddesses and sky-born lords. But now a new voice begins to echo, not loud at first, not with banners or war cries, but with scrolls, with prophets, with the quiet force of faith. Somewhere inland, in hills and olive groves beyond Gaza's sight, a new belief is taking shape. It does not arrive all at once. It unfolds over generations. In the highlands, small tribes gather under stories passed down through campfire smoke. Stories of exile, of covenant, of a wandering patriarch named Abraham, of deliverance from Egypt, of laws carved in stone. The Israelites, their name, even now, comes with weight, but in those early days, it was barely more than a whispered identity. A people still forming, still unsure of themselves, moving between valleys, building small altars, etching belief into bones of survival. Yet their ideas begin to travel. As Israel rises to the north and Judah forms the south, Gaza finds itself wedged between them, geographically, culturally, spiritually. It is not part of these kingdoms, not fully, but it feels their presence. Caravans bring their goods, but also their stories. Merchants from Judea bring more than pottery. They bring scriptures or fragments of them, psalms, proverbs, the beginnings of something sacred that moves not with armies, but with memory. And Gaza listens. It does not forget its own gods, not yet. The old altars still stand. Offerings are still made to local deities. But the idea of one God, unseen, unnamed, indivisible, begins to take root. It is a quiet shift, as most religious changes are. In the homes of traders and scribes, people begin to speak of Yahweh, not loudly, not in place of the gods they already know, but beside them, at first, as if the new God were simply another among many. But Yahweh will not stay among many. That is not his way. His worship demands exclusivity. No graven image. No rivals. He is not content to sit beside Baal and Dagon. He asks to be alone, exalted, supreme, and slowly the choice is made. In some parts of Gaza, altars are pulled down. In others, they are simply abandoned. Scrolls begin to replace statues. The gods once carved into amulets are now invoked through words, through breath, through silence. This change does not come with violence. Not in Gaza. It comes with inheritance, with exposure, with the slow gravity of influence. Gaza is still Philistine in memory, still Canaanite in its bones, still Persian in its politics. But the hills to the east are whispering, and Gaza is listening. There are prophets now, strange men from the desert, wrapped in wool, speaking with fire in their voices. They speak not of many gods, but of one God who demands justice, who hears the cries of the poor, who topples kings and lifts up the broken. This is a new kind of divinity, not a god of crops and weather, but a god of conscience. And conscience, once awakened, is hard to silence. In time, these prophets gain followers. Their words spread through letters, through memory, through exile. People begin to speak of Jerusalem, not just as a city, but as an idea, a holy place, a center of faith. Gaza remains at the edge. It does not convert all at once, but the current is strong. Families in Gaza now read from scrolls brought by merchants. They begin to observe new festivals. Passover, perhaps, or the Sabbath, the strange day of rest that makes Gaza streets oddly still every seventh day. And yet, life continues as it always has. The fish are still caught from the sea. The olives are still pressed by hand. Children still chase each other through sunlit alleys. The god may be shifting, but the city breathes with the same steady rhythm. Even the idea of monotheism, so radical, so complete, does not erase the past. In some homes, you might still find an amulet to an older god tucked in a drawer, a statue half buried behind a wall. Belief does not move in straight lines. It meanders, it folds, it forgets and remembers at once. And yet, by the time Babylon comes, the idea of Yahweh has taken hold. Not everywhere, not in every heart, but enough that when Jerusalem falls and its people are driven out, some of them come west. To Gaza, to a city already leaning toward their God, they bring more than grief. They bring theology, the beginnings of written scripture, the law, the prophets, the sacred songs. And Gaza listens again. A synagogue rises here, modest and quiet, beside older structures, stone benches, a chest for scrolls, a candle burning low. Men gather to read, to study, to question. This is not conquest. It is something slower, a kind of surrender to an idea that has proven durable. One God, one covenant, one people. But even in this, Gaza remains itself. The city does not become Judean. It becomes something else, something between. A city that receives, absorbs, reflects. It is not a city of prophets, but of listeners. Not a city of holy books, but of quiet readers. In time, Gaza will have its own Jewish community, its own sages, its own houses of worship. But in these early days, it is still watching, still turning its face toward the hills, still wondering if the God of one people might become the God of all. Let yourself imagine it now. A quiet evening. The sky is soft with sunset. A man lights a lamp in a stone home. His daughter unrolls a scroll. She cannot read, but she watches his eyes move over the words. He murmurs softly, a psalm, a blessing, a story of Moses and water, of manna, of exile and promise. Outside, the sea rustles against the rocks. Somewhere, a woman gathers dates into a bowl. She is humming an old song to a new rhythm. And above it all, the stars begin to emerge, silent and ancient. The gods are changing, but the sky is the same, and Gaza endures. So rest now. Let the gentle pull of faith, memory, and transformation guide you. The city is learning how to believe again, not through fire, but through the quiet unfolding of something deeper than stone. The prophets have spoken, and Gaza, ever listening, begins to understand. Sleep well. There are silences in history that echo louder than any scream. Moments not made of fire or marching feet, but of absence. An empty home, a gate left open, a voice stilled mid-prayer. And so it was in the time of exile. The Babylonians had risen, sweeping across the lands like wind through brittle grass. Their armies had marched not only to conquer, but to uproot. Cities fell, some swiftly, others with defiant slowness. And among them was Jerusalem. The fall of that city is told and retold in lamentation and liturgy. The temple burned, the walls broken, the ark gone, and the people, those who survived, were taken, not slain, not enslaved, but taken, moved from the heart of their land to a place they did not know, exiled. It was not just a physical removal. It was a dislocation of spirit, a shattering of certainty. Because Jerusalem had been more than a capital. It had been promise made stone. It had been sanctuary, center, covenant. And when it fell, everything fell with it. In Babylon, they sat by the rivers and wept. That is what they said. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yeah, we wept when we remembered Zion. But Gaza did not fall. Gaza remained, watching from the edge of ruin. Its streets still swept by familiar winds. Its markets still open. It saw the caravans of the displaced pass by. It heard new accents in the alleys. It watched refugees, some temporary, some permanent, scatter into its courtyards like seeds thrown from a broken hand. Among those who arrived were scribes, priests, people of the book, though the book itself was still in pieces. They brought scrolls rolled tight and fragile. They brought stories, some half-remembered, some sharpened by trauma. They brought songs not of celebration, but of loss. And yet, in that loss, something began. In exile, the Israelites did not forget. They rewrote, reimagined. They gathered their stories as if gathering wheat after storm. Carefully, methodically, as if each kernel mattered. The scrolls were copied. Psalms were sung more softly. Prophets were remembered. Those strange voices who had warned of this very moment. Woe to the city who trusts in walls, one had said. Woe to the people who forget the widow, the orphan, the stranger. Now, In the shadow of defeat, those warnings no longer sounded mad. They sounded like memory, like prophecy. And in Gaza, that echo was heard. This small city by the sea became, for a moment, a resting place of belief, a soft patch of sand where wounded theology could lie down and breathe. The local people, Canaanite by lineage, Philistine by inheritance, Persian by administration, did not push these exiles away. Gaza had always been a place of passage, not permanence, a place where cultures brushed shoulders without fully merging. And now, the exiles brushed past. Some stayed, some taught, and the city changed again. Now, on certain days, you might pass a home where Torah was read aloud, not in temple halls, but in kitchens under flickering lamps between the baking of bread and the folding of cloth. Now, you might see boys learning to recite verses, not in grandeur, but in whispers. Now, you might find hope not in power, but in memory, because the Babylonian exile had done something unexpected. It had stripped away everything and left only belief. No land, no temple, no king, only the stories, the scrolls, the words. And from these, rooted in exile, watered by longing, Judaism began to grow into something stronger than even it had known. Not just a religion of place, but of time. Not just a people of land, but of law. Not just worship by sacrifice, but by study, by speech, by song. Gaza watched this happen, not as participant, but as witness. It saw the exiles find new ways to keep old things alive. The Sabbath, once a temple rite, became a home ritual. The prayers, once murmured behind veils, were now said by rivers, on rooftops, in markets. God, once seated in the temple's holy of holies, was now spoken from anywhere, because there was nowhere else left. This was theology born in grief, but it endured, and Gaza absorbed it. Not all of it, not all at once, but something shifted. New scrolls appeared in local hands. Words once confined to priests became accessible to others. A merchant might quote a proverb. A mother might sing a psalm. A child might speak of a God who hears even in silence. And so, the aftermath of exile became not just a mourning, but a making. In Gaza, life remained humble. Streets still filled with sand. Fish still sizzled over fires. But beneath the ordinary, a new awareness hummed. A sense that the divine could be present even in defeat. That identity could be preserved even in dispersal. That memory was a form of power. This was not revival. It was something gentler. A theology of adaptation. And for the people who had lost everything, that was enough. They did not build new temples in Gaza, but they built community. They did not declare new kings, but they declared the Sabbath. They did not reclaim the past, but they reimagined it. And that is how exile became legacy. One day, they would return, at least some of them. The Persian king, in a gesture of policy or pity, would allow the exiles to go home, to rebuild, to begin again. But not all would go. Some had made homes elsewhere, in Babylon, in Egypt, in Gaza. And those who stayed did not forget where they had come from. They simply chose to remember from a different place. That is the quiet power of survival, to belong without conquering, to endure without noise, to carry the sacred in your pocket rather than behind a wall of stone. Tonight, as you lie still, imagine one of those families. The sun has set. The lamps are lit. A scroll is open on a worn table. A father reads aloud, not with drama, but with steady reverence. His child listens, eyelids heavy, as the story of Joseph is told once again. A story of exile, of famine, of forgiveness. Outside, the sea murmurs. A cat stretches across the threshold. The city, once Philistine, once Egyptian, once Babylonian, breathes slowly under a blanket of stars. History has not forgotten it. It has simply let it sleep for a while. And now, so should you. Breathe in, breathe out. You are not lost. You are simply between chapters. The exile has passed, but its echo will remain. And tomorrow, we will follow that echo to the next voice. But tonight, rest. History does not always arrive with the sound of hooves and horns. Sometimes it arrives in the footsteps of a single man, a man with eyes full of ambition, Maps rolled like dreams beneath his arm, and a sword never far from reach. His name was Alexander. The world would call him the Great. But before the world bowed, before statues were carved in his honor, before myths began to bloom like wildflowers in the wake of his path, he was simply a man from Macedon, young and restless, drawn eastward by a hunger so vast it could not be measured in lands or titles. And Gaza lay waiting. It was not his first conquest, nor his last, but it was one of the most difficult. Gaza did not welcome him with open gates. It stood firm, a coastal city grown used to bending under empire, but not yet ready to break. And so Alexander, used to cities falling like dominoes before him, found Gaza strangely stubborn. The siege began. It was not brief. For 2 months, Alexander laid pressure on Gaza's walls. He built siege towers. He launched arrows. His men dug trenches. And inside, Gaza held its breath. But stone gives way eventually. The walls fell. The city was taken. And history moved on. But not without leaving something behind. Alexander did not conquer just with weapons. He conquered with vision. His goal was not merely to rule the world. It was to remake it, to spread the culture of Greece, its gods and drama, its language and architecture, from the Aegean to the Indus. And Gaza once again became a canvas. Now imagine the city in the days after conquest. The air still smells of ash and smoke, but the streets are quiet again. The blood is scrubbed from the stones. Life resumes, but it does not resume as it was. Something new has arrived. Columns begin to rise. Not rough stone, but smooth, carved marble. The agora is introduced, a public space where merchants gather, but also philosophers, soldiers, strangers. Greek becomes a language of politics, of commerce, of law. You hear in the markets, mixed with older tongues. Kalimera, they say, good day. A gymnasium is built, where young men train their bodies under the eye of Greek instructors. They wrestle, debate, read Homer. A theater is carved into a hill, its tiers waiting for the tragedies of Sophocles and the comedies of Aristophanes. And slowly, Gaza begins to change, not violently, but deeply. Its soul is being reshaped. Religion, too, begins to shift. The gods of Greece arrive. Athena with her owl, Apollo with his lyre, Dionysus crowned with vine leaves. Their temples stand beside older shrines. Incense drifts in new directions. Statues of gods with perfect limbs and empty eyes replace idols worn by centuries. But the people of Gaza do not forget themselves. Not entirely. Beneath the surface of new rituals, old beliefs remain. Yahweh is still worshipped. The scrolls are still read. The Sabbath is still observed behind closed doors. And so Gaza becomes something hybrid. Not Greek, not Semitic, but Hellenistic. A mixture, a compromise, a negotiation between past and present. This is not forced, not entirely. Some in Gaza embrace the new ways. They wear togas, grow trim beards, teach their children Greek verse. Others resist quietly. They keep their language, their stories, their prayers. Most do both, because that is how cities survive. They blend, they bend, they carry the weight of new names without letting go of the old ones. And under Alexander's successors, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria, this transformation deepens. Gaza becomes a city in the image of the Mediterranean world. Its coins bear Greek faces. Its inscriptions curve in Greek script. Its laws are read aloud in Greek courts. But in the alleyways, children still whisper in Aramaic. At sunset, prayers are still said facing east. The Hellenistic world is one of contrast. On one street, a symposium is held. Wine, philosophy, music under oil lamps. On the next, a quiet courtyard glows with the light of Sabbath candles. In one home, a young man reads Plato. In another, a grandmother recites a psalm. And the city holds them both. Let your thoughts slow now. Let them walk through Gaza's streets during this time. The sun is warm, casting golden shadows across whitewashed walls. In the distance, laughter from the theater. Closer by, the rustling of parchment in a scribe's room. A merchant sells amphorae painted with images of satyrs and gods. Next door, a rabbi gently unwraps a scroll older than the city itself. No one is sure where one culture ends and the other begins. And perhaps that is the point. In this Hellenistic world, identity is not lost. It is layered. This layering affects not only architecture and language, but thought. Philosophy begins to influence theology. The questions of Socrates, what is virtue? What is justice? Begin to echo in synagogues. The wisdom of Proverbs is read alongside the logic of Aristotle. Ideas stretch, minds open, and Gaza, small though it is, becomes part of something enormous. A world connected by roads and trade, by letters and law. A world that stretches from Greece to Egypt to Persia. A world with many tongues, but one rhythm. And yet, even in all this change, Gaza remains Gaza. The sea still laps at its shore. The wind still bends the palms. The children still run barefoot through the dust. The city carries every empire in its stones, but it carries something older still, a rhythm of endurance. Alexander is gone. He dies young, far from home, his empire fracturing even as his body cools. But the world he shaped continues, and Gaza remains part of it. When you walk its streets now, you see his legacy not in banners, but in the way buildings rise, in the curve of amphora handles, in the way stars are mapped on temple ceilings. His conquest is complete, not because it erased the old, but because it planted something new beside it. And that is the Hellenistic way. To conquer not only land, but language. Not only temples, but thought. Not only cities, but culture. Tonight, as you lie still, imagine a breeze blowing through a home in Gaza during this time. Clay lamps flicker on low tables. A scroll is read aloud in Greek. A prayer is murmured in Hebrew. A mother tucks her child beneath a woven blanket and sings a lullaby that sounds like both east and west. Outside, the stars will overhead. Orion, known by one name to the Greeks, another to the locals, but still the same shape in the sky. The city breathes, not in rebellion, not in resignation, but in resilience. You are part of that breath. You are part of the long line of listeners, dreamers, rememberers. So let your breath slow now. Let the voices of gods and poets fade. Let Gaza cradle you, its stones warm, its past deep, its future uncertain but always unfolding. The transformation is complete, and sleep like history returns again. The dust does not settle in Gaza for long. Empires shift like wind across the sand, leaving behind fragments, columns, coins, and memory. And now, under the steady march of Roman sandals, the city once again changes hands. Rome does not arrive with mystery. It arrives with marble, with order, with law etched in Latin, and roads that never seem to end. Rome arrives with its banners held high, with governors and centurions and engineers who measure stone not with beauty, but with precision. By the time Gaza is folded into the Roman Empire, the Hellenistic world has already left its mark. The Greeks brought thought and architecture, but the Romans bring structure and permanence. The empire of Alexander shimmered like a dream. Rome is solid like iron. Gaza, once again, becomes a station on a road too wide to fully comprehend. Now, the Roman mile markers line the path into town. The local leaders report to distant governors. Taxes are collected with more regularity than kindness. But stability, strange, heavy, bureaucratic, settles over the region. This is a different kind of empire, not one that demands your soul, but your obedience. One that doesn't care what god you worship, as long as the taxes are paid and the peace is kept. And so Gaza plays its role. It becomes provincial town, orderly and efficient. It grows again. The streets are paved. Aqueducts carry water into courtyards. Bathhouses open with the rising steam of quiet luxury. Markets flourish, bringing wine from Italy, oil from Egypt, incense from Arabia. Roman coins fill the pockets of Gaza's traders, stamped with the faces of emperors none of them will ever see. The theater is rebuilt. Gladiators may have fought there, or perhaps actors perform comedies under painted ceilings. Roman columns now stand beside older Greek foundations. The city is, as always, layered, and religion, always shifting in Gaza, begins to shift once more. At first, The Roman gods arrive as expected. Jupiter, Venus, Mars. Temples rise, bearing their names. Offerings are made. Statues are placed in alcoves, polished and stern. These gods come not with love, but with formality. They rule, but from a distance. Distant figures watching over a distant empire. But deep beneath the surface, another faith is stirring. Not born in Gaza, but not far from it. To the northeast, in a province of Romans called Judea, a quiet revolution begins, not of weapons, but of words. A carpenter's son walks among villages. He speaks in parables. He touches the sick. He eats with outcasts. He speaks not of empire, but the kingdom of heaven. His name is Jesus. His message is simple and radical. Love your enemy. Forgive without limit. Give without fear. His following is small, but growing. And as word spreads, the empire does what empires always do when it feels unsure. It strikes. The man is crucified, a death meant for criminals, displayed like a warning, nails through flesh, a crown of thorns, a sentence carried out under the sign, King of the Jews. But this is not where the story ends, because his followers keep speaking, keep gathering, keep remembering, and slowly, carefully, across roads the Romans themselves built, the message travels. One day, it reaches Gaza, not with fanfare, not with bishops or processions, but with a whisper. A fisherman tells a merchant. A traveler tells a woman at the well. A widow, lonely in her home, is given a scroll. They read it. They do not all understand it, but they feel it. They gather in secret, not out of fear, but out of reverence. In the back rooms of homes, by lamplight, they break bread. They remember the story. They repeat the words, "Do this in remembrance of me." And so, Christianity begins in Gaza not with conquest, but with communion. At first, the Roman authorities do not notice, or they do not care. But as the faith grows, so does suspicion. These people do not worship the emperor. They do not burn incense before Jupiter's altar. They do not attend the festivals. They refuse the games. They gather in catacombs. They bury their dead differently. They speak of a resurrection. And then the persecution begins. It is not always violent, but it is steady. Christians in Gaza are watched. Some are arrested. Some vanish. But many remain. They continue to meet, to sing, to hope. Their symbols are scratched into walls. Not crosses yet, but fish, anchors, doves. Signs that speak not of power, but of presence. Not of rule, but of resilience. Then everything changes. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine does what no one expects. He embraces the faith. Christianity, once hunted, becomes protected, then accepted. Then, astonishingly, it becomes a religion of the empire itself. And Gaza, always listening, always adapting, changes once more. Now churches are built, not hidden. The first bishop of Gaza is appointed. His name is mentioned in letters preserved for centuries. The community expands. Baptisms become public. Hymns are sung aloud. The faith that once trembled in the corners now walks proudly in the sun. But transitions are never simple. Gaza, a city of many gods, now faces a new choice. What to do with the old ones? Temples to Roman and Greek deities are slowly abandoned. Some are torn down. Others are converted. Pillars repurposed, altars cleansed. Not all are pleased. Some grieve the loss of the old ways. Some resist. Some remember the days when incense rose to Venus and wine spilled for Dionysus. But the new faith is patient. It does not need to win every heart, only enough. And so Gaza becomes a Christian city, in its own way, not with triumph, but with quiet conviction. Monasteries rise in the hills. Scrolls are copied by candlelight. Pilgrims pass through on their way to Jerusalem. Saints are buried. Miracles are whispered. And yet life continues much as it always has. The bread is still baked. The olives still pressed. The wind still curls through the narrow streets. Now, a priest walks where a rabbi once stood. Now, a psalm is sung where a play was once performed. But the rhythm remains, because Gaza has never been about absolutes. It absorbs. It adapts. It is not the temple or the forum. It is the road between. And on that road, faith has found a place to grow. Let your thoughts slow now. Imagine a morning in Christian Gaza. The sun rises. A bell rings from a simple church. A woman gathers water. A boy recites a prayer. A monk opens a scroll. Outside, the sea is calm. The city, once Greek, once Roman, now Christian, exhales. And you, gentle listener, breathe with it. The past does not disappear. It settles. In the stone beneath the church, you can still find fragments of pagan altar. In the chants, you can still hear echoes of older songs. But the light is different now. Softer, more forgiving. And the city sleeps in it. So rest too. The empire is vast, but the night is quiet. You are here, and so is Gaza. Changing, always. Enduring, always. Faithful in its own quiet way. Sleep now. There is one more transformation to come, but not tonight. The sea does not choose sides. It touches every shore with the same breath. And so too does Gaza, always caught between empires, between ideas, between gods. It is a city not of absolutes, but of layers. And nowhere is this more evident than in its faith. Here, belief does not arrive as a single torch passed hand to hand. It arrives like morning light, slow, filtered through clouds, coloring the same world differently as the hours pass. For Gaza, religion was never just devotion. It was identity, language, memory, trade. It was the salt and bread, the hand on the child's head, the chant that drifted upward while incense burned low. And so, when the world changed, when God shifted, when temples gave way to churches or mosques or none at all, Gaza didn't break. It blended. This is the story of syncretism, of how faiths met not on battlefields, but at dinner tables, in market stalls, in whispered prayers said in borrowed words. In Gaza, the lines between religions have always blurred. Once, Baal's name was called from high places, his thunder, his rain. Then came Dagon, the sea god of the Philistines, invoked by fishermen hauling nets along the coast. Later, Yahweh's name was carried on scrolls, his presence written into law, his silence revered above all. Then Jesus was spoken of in homes with lamps lit low, his cross carved into walls, his stories told beside those of David and Elijah. But even then, the shift was not clean. Some homes in Gaza carried both traditions for a time. Old altars sat beside new icons. Children were named after prophets from different books. Festivals were combined, woven into each other like threads from separate looms. The lighting of candles, the breaking of bread, the keeping of silence. These things outlive doctrine. Syncretism is not confusion. It is survival. And in Gaza, it made faith more human. A Greek merchant bows in a Roman temple, but keeps a Canaanite charm in his pocket. A Jewish fisherman utters a blessing learned from his grandfather, while nodding respectfully at the Christian bishop passing by. A pagan woman lights a candle for Athena and another for Mary, just in case. No one is certain, but everyone remembers. In the schools, texts from different worlds are studied side by side. A fragment of Plato, a verse from Isaiah, a proverb passed down orally for generations before it was written at all. And still, the sea keeps coming in. Islam, though not yet arrived in Gaza during this phase of our story, waits just beyond the edge of time, ready to bring its own voice to this choir. But even before it comes, the city already knows how to make room. It has been making room for thousands of years. In the heart of the city, a family sits to eat. There is no argument about which God is watching. The food is blessed in a quiet murmur. One child recites a verse from a psalm. Another hums a melody from a street performance inspired by Dionysian rites. A third simply watches the steam rise from the stew, content to belong to all of it and none of it. Faith in Gaza is not about possession. It is about participation. Temples are reused. Stones are rearranged. A synagogue becomes a church. A church is built on the ruins of a shrine. Each layer visible, if you know how to look. Sometimes, the walls tell the story best. Here is a fresco of a saint, his feet standing where a priest of Baal once poured wine onto the earth. Here is a Hebrew inscription carved into a stone that now supports a Christian baptismal font. Here is a mosaic floor, geometric, abstract, meant to appease no particular god, but pleasing to the eye of any. Time passes, belief changes, but the city holds it all. Even as empires name their gods and demand loyalty, the people of Gaza do what people have always done. They adapt without erasing. They remember what they must. They forget what they can. They carry fragments forward, like shells collected along the beach. Cracked, smooth, weathered, beautiful. And when asked what they believe, they do not answer in creeds. They answer with stories. My grandmother used to say, "We always light a candle on this night. We sing this song when someone is born. We cover the mirrors when someone dies." Faith in Gaza is not about theology. It is about gesture, practice, atmosphere. And so, when new beliefs come, and they always come, the city does not resist violently. It breathes. It shifts. It murmurs. It welcomes without surrendering. Even the Romans, with their insistence on order, cannot extinguish this softness. Even Christianity, with its new structure, cannot erase what came before. They may claim the city, reshape its rituals, mark new dates on the calendar. But beneath it all, Gaza's soul remains syncretic, a woven rug, not a single thread. And this, in its quiet way, is holiness. A holiness that does not insist. A holiness that listens. A holiness that accepts that no one knows everything, and that all gods may speak, if only in different tongues. Let yourself drift now into this moment. Imagine a Gaza evening during this time. The market is closing. The sun is low. A man finishes reading a scroll, half of it sacred, half of it philosophical. A woman passes, holding rosemary and figs. She nods to the man, whispers a blessing, one he recognizes, though it comes from a different book. Two boys chase each other between pillars. One wears a necklace with a cross. The other carries a wooden charm carved with ancient symbols. No one stops them. Far above, a star appears. Then another, and below, the city settles into its night, not as a fortress of one belief, but as a garden of many, not in division, but in dialogue, not in certainty, but in slow, enduring grace. So sleep now under Gaza's stars. Let the old gods watch over you. Let the newer ones hum softly in the distance. Let their voices blend into a lullaby older than language. You are safe here, in this place that has made peace not by choosing sides, but by choosing to remember. Gaza, the city of thresholds, the place between, where no faith is ever fully lost, and no truth is ever fully alone. Let your breath follow the rhythm of that knowing, and rest. Segment 3. Crescent and Cross, Crusades, Caliphates, and the Sacred Siege. The stars above Gaza had seen empires rise and fall, Assyrian banners fading into Babylonian flame, Greek columns replaced by Roman bricks, Christian hymns echoing where pagan chants once rose. The city had listened to every god, knelt before every throne, welcomed every tongue. But now, the wind carried a new word, one not born in palaces or forged by philosophers. Allahu Akbar. The call did not come from Gaza itself. It came from the desert, from the sands of Arabia, a message shaped not by empire, but by revelation, not whispering corners, but declared under open sky. The Prophet Muhammad had passed away, but his words, recited, memorized, loved, moved faster than armies. And soon they reached Gaza, not with siege, not with violence, not at first. The Rashidun Caliphate, led by those closest to the Prophet, sent armies north not merely to conquer, but to expand a community of belief. Gaza was not a battleground in those early years. It was a stop, a crossing, a place to receive something new. When the Muslim armies arrived around 637 CE, Gaza surrendered with little resistance. It had no reason to fight. It had seen too many rulers come and go. And so, the city opened itself again, not out of fear, but out of custom. The Muslims who entered Gaza did not tear down its churches or burn its books. They paid respect to what they found. They understood, perhaps more than most, that sacred things do not belong to one people alone. They offered protection. They offered structure. They offered something Gaza understood well: continuity. The city was placed under the governance of the newly forming caliphate. Taxes were collected, but the people, Christian, Jewish, Samaritan, were allowed to worship. They became dhimmi-protected peoples. Not equal, not powerful, but safe. For many, this was enough. And so, Islam began its quiet work in Gaza, not through decree, but through daily life. A call to prayer echoed softly across rooftops. A new calendar began to be used, marked not by imperial coronations, but by a migration, Hijra. A mosque was built, not grand at first, but firm. A new center of worship, a new direction to face, Mecca. But Gaza, as always, did not forget. The churches remained. The synagogue stood. The scrolls were still read. The psalms still sung. The Sabbath candles still lit. Now, they did so beside neighbors who knelt 5 times a day, whose mouths memorized the Quran with the same reverence others reserved for the Torah or the Gospel. In the marketplace, languages mingled like spices. Arabic began to rise, slow and steady, but Greek still clung to the corners. Hebrew was kept for prayer, Aramaic for memory. Faiths lived side by side, not in harmony always, but in proximity. The Rashidun Caliphate passed, and the Umayyads followed. From Damascus, they ruled not as spiritual leaders alone, but as monarchs, kings in all but name. They adorned their cities with grandeur, built mosques with domes that caught the morning sun, and minted coins that bore no image but words, verses from Quran etched into silver and gold. In Gaza, this influence was gentle. The roads were improved. Trade increased. Pilgrims passed through on their way to Jerusalem or Hebron. Scholars arrived, bringing commentaries in law, logic, and medicine. The city, always a listener, listened once again. The Umayyads brought a vision of Islam that was both religious and imperial. Their caliphs wore silk and carried swords, recited scripture and issued law. They built, not just to serve the faithful, but to remind the world who now stood at its center. And Gaza, ever near the threshold of change, began to reflect that center. More mosques were built, some large, some humble. The Great Mosque of Gaza, believed to stand on the site of a former Philistine temple, was likely expanded in these years. The past reused, sanctified again. A school for the study of Quran opened. Children sat cross-legged on woven mats, swaying as they recited. The Arabic script, once foreign, became familiar. Names began to shift. Maryam for Mary, Musa for Moses, Isa for Jesus. The prophets were still there, but the stories now flowed from a different book. Yet for many, this was not rupture. It was recognition. Because Islam, in its earliest form, did not erase the prophets of old. It honored them. It wove them into its own lineage. Abraham became Ibrahim, the friend of God. Jesus, a revered messenger, born of a virgin, full of compassion. And so Gaza, with its long memory, did not resist this new narrative. It simply added it to the shelf. In homes, parents told stories from 3 books: the Torah, the Gospel, the Quran. Different endings, perhaps different lessons, but often the same names, the same wells, the same longing. The people of Gaza adjusted, as they always had. Some converted to Islam, slowly, voluntarily, over generations. Some remained in their older traditions, protected, taxed, but largely left alone. Intermarriage was rare, but respect was common. Religious debates were held in courtyards, not courts. And when one man died, his neighbor, whatever his creed, came to mourn. The call to prayer now rose from the minarets, 5 times a day, slicing gently to the hum of the market and the hush of the sea. Children learned to write in Arabic, etching letters into smooth boards with styluses dipped in ink. Dates were now remembered by the moon. The week curved toward Friday, but the bones of the city remained. The streets, the stones, the staircases worn by centuries of feet. And underneath the new domes, the same wind blew. Sometimes at night, when the city lay still, an elder might whisper a prayer older than Islam, not in defiance, but in reverence. not because he had forgotten the new names, but because he still remembered the old ones. And God, he believed, listened just the same. Let your breath slow now. Imagine Gaza in these early centuries of Islam. A city not shaken, but shifting. Palm trees sway under a warm dusk. A muezzin calls from a minaret shaped like a lighthouse. In the courtyard of a church, a candle still flickers behind closed shutters. Down a narrow street, a rabbi gently corrects a student's pronunciation. In a doorway, a mother recites a lullaby from her childhood. A melody so old, no one remembers where it came from. Above them, the stars glimmer. The same stars watched by Canaanites, by Greeks, by Romans, now watched by Muslims, Christians, Jews, and perhaps by something beyond them all. In Gaza, belief does not compete. It echoes, and you, safe beneath this ancient sky, are part of that echo. So close your eyes. Let the call to prayer become a lullaby. Let the lamp light become a night light. Let the stories of prophets, whichever names they bear, guide you gently into sleep. The city endures. The faith evolves. The silence holds. And you are not alone. Sleep well. The sand of Gaza have always known footsteps. Caravans with bells tied to their mules. Traders with polished beads in leather pouches. Scribes carrying ledgers filled with looping ink. And under the Abbasid Caliphate, those footsteps grew more numerous, more organized, more purposeful. For the Abbasids, who rose in the year 750, ruling from the golden crescents of Baghdad, were not just inheritors of faith. They were architects of a new Islamic world, one built not on the sword, but on systems, on trade, on language, on law. And Gaza, once again, stood ready, not to resist, but to receive. The city by the sea became a modest but vital thread in a web stretching across continents. From the ports of Al-Andalus to the tea stalls of Samarkand, from the spice markets of Cairo to the gardens of Shiraz, an economy bloomed, vast and intricate, buzzing with motion. And Gaza, nestled between Jerusalem and Egypt, hummed gently with its own rhythm. Under Abbasid rule, the city was no longer a border town. It was a node, a quiet checkpoint on the path between capitals, holy sites, and merchant cities. Its role was not loud, but steady. You might not find it mentioned in epic poems or palatial records, but if you follow the caravan trails, you would find it always there. A place to rest, to trade, to speak, to learn. New roads were paved, or old ones mended. Milestones set, way stations built where tired camels could be watered, and travelers could pray. Taxation became more consistent, and in turn, so did infrastructure. Markets expanded. The rhythms of commerce began to beat in sync with the broader Abbasid world. And with trade came stories. You could hear Persian proverbs in Gaza's tea houses, taste Indian spices in its stews, smell Chinese silk, faintly perfumed, wrapped in cedar crates. The city spoke in many tongues, Arabic now dominant, but always beside Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. In the corners, even Latin might be heard, whispers from distant pilgrims lost or wandering. The Abbasid era was not a time of conquest for Gaza. It was a time of connection. And connection, more than anything, shaped the soul of the city. Merchants became bridges, scholars, translators. Children memorized Quranic verses by day and listened to travelers' tales by night, of cities with golden domes, of rivers wide as dreams, of libraries so large they made the sky feel small. In this age, Gaza learned not just to survive, but to integrate, to find its place not by power, but by presence. It did not try to compete with Baghdad or Damascus or Fustat. It did not raise towering minarets or boast of great armies. Instead, it listened, it welcomed, it held. And so, the fabric of the Abbasid world passed through it, slowly, steadily, like thread through a loom. Scholars came, some to stay, others merely pausing on their way elsewhere. They discussed astronomy under palm trees, calculated angles, and told the stories of ancient Greece, newly translated into Arabic. There may have been a small madrasa, a school where the young learned more than just the Quran, where logic was taught beside poetry, where the works of Plato and Galen, filtered through Arabic minds, were passed from hand to hand like rare stones. Doctors wrote prescriptions in Gaza. Judges issued rulings under Abbasid law. Traders made contracts that spanned 3 languages and 5 cities. Life was not rich, but it was stable. And stability, after centuries of empire, was its own kind of wealth. The mosque was now the center of life, not just for prayer, but for education, for administration, for rest. Its courtyard was filled with murmurs, not grand speeches, but the steady rhythm of people exchanging greetings, grievances, gossip. On Fridays, the city paused. The market quieted. A sermon was given, and perhaps, somewhere in that gathering, a man from Kufa stood beside a man from Hebron, listening not to politics, but to poetry disguised as prayer. Religion during this period did not suppress economy. It shaped it. Ethics became part of trade. Honesty was praised in every transaction. Contracts began with God's name. Trust was not only a matter of reputation, but of devotion. And still, beyond faith, life continued. Children played. Women prepared meals with ingredients that had crossed seas. Men argued over prices, then laughed it off with tea. Figs dried on rooftops. Water was drawn from deep, hand-cut wells. Cats lounged in the shade of sun-bleached walls. And every so often, a stranger would arrive with news from far away. A drought in Persia, a rebellion in the north, a new book, causing whispers in the courts of Baghdad. Gaza, small and patient, heard it all. It did not act. It absorbed, because that was its gift, to be a listener, a resting place, a bridge. In the Abbasid era, the city was not transformed by war or fire. It was reshaped slowly, like stone smoothed by water. Its faith deepened. Its culture expanded. Its people remained. And at night, the stars above the city glimmered with quiet approval. Trade routes may shift. Dynasties may fall. But the breath of a city like Gaza is not measured in battles. It is measured in bread baked before dawn, in stories passed from grandfather to child, in ledgers scratched onto parchment, then folded and tied with string. This was a golden age, not because Gaza grew rich, but because it found its place. Let yourself drift into that time now. The call to prayer has faded into silence. The shops are closed. The streets swept clean. A candle glows in a scholar's home. He leans over a scroll, translating from Syriac to Arabic, trying to understand the shape of a thought born in Athens, reborn in Baghdad, and now passing through Gaza like a bird looking for rest. Outside, 2 travelers share a blanket beneath a fig tree. One is from Egypt, the other from somewhere beyond the Tigris. They do not speak the same language, not well, but they share a bowl of lentils. And that is enough. The city sleeps, not afraid, not uncertain, but steady, still, held together by roads, by memory, by the rhythm of a life gently lived. And you, too, are part of that rhythm. So close your eyes. Let the slow pulse of history carry you, not in a rush, but in a caravan of dreams. The Abbasids are far away, but their presence is felt here, in the ink on the page, in the scent of foreign spices, in the quiet safety of a town that has learned how to last. You are safe, and Gaza still endures. Sleep well. Peace in Gaza, like the tide, was never permanent. It rolled in with the Abbasids, soft and promising, a hush after the storm. But history does not rest for long in cities like this. Places shaped not just by geography, but by proximity to every fault line between belief, power, and ambition. And so, even as Gaza quietly prospered, its markets humming with dialects and its mosques echoing with recitation, a new wind began to stir. This one came from the west, from Egypt, from a new dynasty with a different claim to righteousness. The Fatimids, they arrived not as mere conquerors, but as challengers to the very core of the Islamic world's spiritual authority. When the Abbasids ruled from Baghdad, cloaked in Sunni orthodoxy, the Fatimids rose in North Africa bearing a Shia banner, bold, ideological, and precise. And Gaza, so close to Egypt, found itself once again on the edge of a tectonic shift. The Fatimids were not unkind to cities that surrendered. Their reach was subtle at first, through governors, taxes, messengers, but their presence was unmistakable. In Gaza, the Qutba, the Friday sermon, was now offered in the name of the Fatimid Caliph, not the Abbasid. Coins were minted with different inscriptions. The black banners of Baghdad were replaced by the white silks of Cairo. For most in Gaza, this change was quiet, bureaucratic. A different name on a decree, a new emblem on the tax collector's robe. But in the mosques and schools, in the homes of scholars and merchants, the tension could be felt like pressure in the air before a storm. Because this was not merely a political transition, it was theological. The Fatimids, as Ismaili Shia, believed in a line of imams hidden from the world. A divine light passed through a chosen few. Their theology was philosophical, mystical, and deeply structured. They built libraries with texts the Abbasids would have burned. Their scholars debated with logic sharper than swords. In Gaza, they tried to make space for their beliefs. But space is a fragile thing in a city already layered with centuries of faith. Some embraced the new ideas, drawn to their clarity or novelty. Others kept their Sunni traditions quiet, but unchanged. Many simply watched, as they always had, knowing that rulers change, but neighbors remain. And still, the daily life of the city continued. Figs were dried in the sun. Olive presses groaned under the weight of the harvest. Scribes copied Quranic verses in careful Kufic script. Children splashed in fountains while old men argued over prices and profits beneath shaded awnings. But unrest, though not always visible, builds like sediment in a river. And Gaza, sitting on the edge of multiple worlds, soon felt another ripple, this time from the east. The Seljuks. They were Turkic warriors, nomads at first, transformed into empire builders with surprising speed. Fierce defenders of Sunni orthodoxy, they saw the Fatimids not as distant rivals, but as heretics who had usurped the rightful path of Islam. Their vision was simple: to restore Sunni dominance under protection of the Abbasid Caliphate. But their methods were not simple. They came with armies, and in the late 11th century, their shadow began to fall over Gaza. The city, already worn by the weight of contradictions, now faced intrusion, not just from an empire, but from chaos. Because when titans fight, it is always the borderlands that bleed. Gaza became contested, not in grand battles with trumpets and flags, but in skirmishes, in whispers, in fear. Fatimid governors built new fortifications, watchtowers, walls. Old Roman stones were pulled from ruins to reinforce new barracks. Horses were bred not for beauty, but for speed. Scouts were sent into the hills. Seljuk raids came quickly without warning. Sometimes they looted. Sometimes they simply passed through. The threat was not constant, but it was never absent. And so Gaza tensed. Commerce slowed. Pilgrims avoided its roads. Markets grew quieter. Traders hesitated to travel with full loads. A city that once hummed like a stringed instrument was now out of tune, waiting unsure. And still, people adapted. They always did. When soldiers came, doors were barred. When they left, streets were swept. Weddings still happened, quieter now. Babies were still born. Bread still rose in ovens, even if it was shared more sparingly. Religious life, too, became more cautious. The city's imams and scholars walked a narrow ridge, speak too loudly of Abbasid virtue, and the Fatimid authorities would notice. Appear too friendly with Cairo, and the Seljuk scouts would suspect you of betrayal. And so, sermons grew vague. Teachings were offered with a smile and a warning. Young men were advised to be humble, women to be discreet, and old men to stop quoting the Abbasids in the streets. But beneath the tension, something new was growing, a strange kind of resilience. Gaza had been conquered, ruled, taxed, blessed, cursed, rebuilt, and left behind, but never quite broken. And under the pressure of Fatimid doctrine and Seljuk intrusion, the city developed something quieter than resistance: persistence. People began to rely less on rulers, more on each other. A merchant might shelter a traveler without asking who sent him. A teacher might lend a book and say only, return it when it's safe. The city's loyalty was not a caliph's or imam's, but to its own memory. And in that memory, faith remained fluid. You might hear a prayer that started in Sunni form, but ended in Shia cadence. You might hear stories where Musa and Moses shared the same tears. where a Fatimid scholar praised a Seljuk poet under his breath, where truth was not declared, but carried gently between hearts. Because in Gaza, belief had long since stopped being about winning. It was about remembering. And so, the storm passed. Eventually, the Fatimids lost power. The Seljuks faded. New rulers came. But Gaza remained. Not untouched, but unbeaten. The scars left by those years, the broken walls, the abandoned caravans, the silence in once busy lanes, healed slowly. Life returned, uncertain but steady. Because Gaza knows how to wait. It had waited through Babylon, through Caesar, through Caliph and Crusader. It would wait again. And when the traders returned, when the figs ripened again, when children sang once more in the alleyways, the city exhaled, not in relief, but in ritual. Because to live in Gaza is not to hope for peace. It is to live as if peace already exists. To rise with the sun, even if the night was restless. To offer tea, even if you are not sure you will have more. To teach your child a prayer, even if the words change tomorrow. To love the city, even when it does not love you back. Let your breath fall now into that rhythm. Picture Gaza in those uncertain years. A half-mended wall, a shuttered mosque, a school with more silence than speech, but also a pot of lentils still simmering, a woman stitching a garment with thread saved from better times, a boy skipping stones into the sea, smiling as if the world has never burned. And overhead, the stars blink, unconcerned, eternal. You too are under that sky now. And whatever battles rage beyond your door, this moment belongs to you. So rest. The Fatimids are gone. The Seljuks are past. But the breath of Gaza remains. Slow, soft, faithful. And tonight it waits with you. Sleep well. In the long history of Gaza, the Crusades brought another chapter of foreign rule, military conflict, and religious transformation. These events did not erupt suddenly, but built up slowly over years of tension and expansion across the region. By the late 11th century, Gaza was once again drawn into a geopolitical struggle between rising powers, this time between Christian crusading forces from Europe and Muslim rulers across the Levant and Egypt. When the First Crusade began in 1096, its target was Jerusalem, not Gaza. However, the shockwaves of that movement would eventually reach Gaza's walls. As European knights carved out kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean, Gaza's location became increasingly strategic. It stood on the road between Jerusalem and Egypt, a valuable corridor for any army, whether for supply lines, reinforcements, or retreat. After the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders gradually expanded their influence to south, and Gaza eventually came under control of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Once in Crusader hands, Gaza was fortified. The Crusaders were skilled at building military infrastructure, and they saw Gaza as a forward base near the Egyptian frontier. They constructed defensive walls and outposts. Most notably, they built Blanchgar Castle, located on a hill south of the city. From this vantage point, Crusader knights could monitor southern trade and military routes. The castle served both as a deterrent to Egyptian forces and as a symbolic marker of Crusader presence deep in formerly Muslim-held lands. Under Latin rule, Gaza became a garrison town. The city's mosques were converted into churches or left abandoned. Religious life for Muslims and local Christians who were not aligned with the Latin Church became more restricted. Arabic was replaced by Latin and Old French in administration. European settlers arrived, though in relatively small numbers. The local population, as in many other Crusader territories, often adapted in order to survive, learning to live under the authority of a foreign regime that had little cultural or religious connection to them. Trade continued during the Crusader period, but under stricter terms. The Crusader state imposed new taxes and controlled caravan routes. While this limited economic freedom, it did not erase local trade altogether. Gaza's market adapted, and some merchants even benefited from cross-cultural exchange, particularly those able to navigate between Arabic-speaking and Frankish-speaking communities. Still, there was a general decline in prosperity as political instability and the constant threat of military action disrupted life. The Crusaders maintained control of Gaza intermittently throughout the 12th century. Their presence, however, remained precarious. Gaza lay close to the border of Muslim-controlled territories in Egypt, and tension remained constant. During this period, Saladin, a Muslim leader of Kurdish origin, rose to prominence. As commander of Muslim forces and later founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, Saladin aimed to reclaim the lands taken by the Crusaders, not only for political power but also as a religious mission. Saladin's campaign against the Crusader states intensified in the 1170s and 1180s. After his famous victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the subsequent recapture of Jerusalem, Muslim forces advanced into surrounding territories. Gaza, being part of the Crusader defensive network, was one of the towns reclaimed during this campaign. The Crusaders evacuated their positions, and Blanchgard Castle was either dismantled or fell into disuse. Saladin's forces encountered little resistance in Gaza, and the city returned to Muslim control under the Ayyubid banner. The Ayyubid period brought relative calm to Gaza. Saladin did not treat the city harshly, nor did he seek to punish its inhabitants. Instead, the emphasis was on restoring Islamic governance and religious institutions. Mosques were reopened or rebuilt, and the city was reintegrated into the broader Muslim world, which stretched from Syria to Egypt. Sunni Islam was promoted as the official doctrine, and religious scholars were encouraged to settle and teach. While Gaza did not become a major political center during the Ayyubid period, it regained its position as a small but stable regional town. Trade routes were reestablished, especially those linking Egypt and Palestine. Pilgrims once again traveled through Gaza on their way to Jerusalem or Cairo. Small markets reopened. The return of Muslim rule also brought administrative continuity, and the city benefited from the relatively efficient governance of the Ayyubids. Economically, Gaza began to recover slowly. The city did not return to prosperity it had known in earlier centuries, but basic services resumed, and people began rebuilding their lives. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, with olives, wheat, and fruits produced in surrounding villages. Traders who had fled during the Crusader occupation gradually returned. A small but noticeable revival in learning and religious activity took place as scholars traveled along the reconnected roads. Gaza's role during the Ayyubid reconquest was more symbolic than strategic. It represented the reclaiming of Muslim land and identity. Although it remained a modest town compared to Jerusalem or Cairo, its location ensured that it remained part of the regional political map. Its recovery served as a signal that Muslim rule was once again dominant in the area. Throughout this period, the people of Gaza continued to adapt. Whether under Crusader or Ayyubid rule, the city's population endured changes in language, law, and religious authority. Many residents had lived through multiple transitions. By the time the Ayyubids ruled, families in Gaza had experienced governance by Fatimids, Seljuks, Crusaders, and now a new Sunni dynasty. This history of adjustment shaped a resilient and cautious population, one that prioritized continuity of life over allegiance to transient rulers. The Crusades and their aftermath did not erase Gaza's identity. If anything, they added another layer to its long story. Each set of rulers brought new systems, beliefs, and expectations, but they did not erase the past. In fact, the buildings, languages, and even the names of streets often bore traces of earlier times. A mosque might stand where a Crusader chapel once stood. A family name might recall roots from Egypt, Kurdistan, or even Europe. By the end of the 12th century, Gaza was quieter than before, but still standing. It was not powerful, but it was present. And in a region where cities rose and fell with empires, Gaza's ability to persist became its strength. It had survived yet another invasion, another ideological struggle, and another shift in who claimed authority over its people. For the ordinary residents of Gaza, daily life remained a constant. Children played in alleyways. Farmers tended their crops. Traders reopened their stalls. Teachers taught young boys to recite the Quran. Life continued, slowly but surely. And so Gaza, often caught in the crosswinds of larger forces, once again absorbed the change, adjusted, and carried on. Following the Ayyubid period, Gaza entered yet another phase in its long and shifting history. The Mamluks, who rose to power in Egypt after defeating the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, became the new rulers of much of the eastern Mediterranean, including Gaza. Their rule over the city would last for several centuries, bringing both administrative order and long-term stagnation. The Mamluk Sultanate was a military regime ruled by former slave soldiers who had risen through the ranks to control Egypt and Syria. Though their origins were unconventional, the Mamluks proved to be capable administrators and fierce defenders of their territories. Under their control, Gaza was incorporated into a larger provincial system that linked Egypt, Palestine, and Syria. The Mamluks appointed local governors in Gaza, usually military officials loyal to the Sultan in Cairo. These governors were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring that trade and travel could proceed safely through the region. Gaza's position along important caravan and pilgrimage routes made it strategically valuable, even if it did not hold major political or economic influence. During the Mamluk era, Gaza experienced a period of relative peace. The city no longer faced the same scale of military threats that had defined previous centuries. There were occasional skirmishes and regional disputes, but compared to the instability of Crusader and Ayyubid times, the Mamluk period was notably calm. This allowed the population to stabilize and some aspects of daily life to normalize. Religious life flourished under the Mamluks. As staunch Sunnis, the Mamluk rulers promoted orthodox Islamic scholarship. They built and supported madrasas, mosques, and Sufi lodges throughout their territories. In Gaza, Islamic learning was encouraged, and local scholars played a modest role in regional religious life. Religious coexistence was tolerated through the millet system, which allowed Jews and Christians to practice their faiths with limited autonomy under Muslim rule. The economy of Gaza under the Mamluks remained modest. The city was primarily sustained by agriculture, and its role as a stopping point for caravans. Olive oil production, soap making, and textile work were among the main industries. Although Gaza never became wealthy, it achieved a kind of sustainable self-sufficiency. Caravans moving between Egypt and the Levant continued to stop in the city, bringing a modest flow of goods and information. In this period, Gaza was not a cultural or political center, but retained a quiet resilience. Its residents led mostly rural and market-centered lives. Townspeople traded in local goods, while villagers cultivated crops in the surrounding countryside. Education continued through local religious institutions, and family networks provided stability across generations. Travelers and pilgrims often described Gaza as quiet, even sleepy. It did not boast the grandeur of Cairo or Damascus, but it held historical significance and served as a link in the larger network of the Islamic world. Writers noted its coastal position, the remnants of older civilizations, and its layered religious history. However, the Mamluk period was not without challenges. Natural disasters, such as earthquakes and droughts, occasionally disrupted life. Moreover, as the centuries progressed, the administrative efficiency of the Mamluk system began to decline. Corruption among local officials increased, and investment in public infrastructure diminished. Roads became harder to travel. Wells went unrepaired. Gaza slowly began to feel neglected. By the late Mamluk period, signs of decay were visible. Though the city remained under control and did not suffer from open rebellion or invasion, it no longer held the vitality of earlier times. The economy grew stagnant. Population growth slowed. Even religious scholarship began to shift to other regions where patronage and resources were more abundant. Despite this, Gaza remained. Its survival during the Mamluk era was not marked by great achievements or dramatic transformations, but by its endurance. Through cycles of neglect and minor restoration, the city preserved its basic structure and community. In many ways, the Mamluk period set the tone for Gaza's role in the coming centuries, a place of continuity rather than innovation. The order imposed by the Mamluks, though increasingly inefficient, allowed daily life to continue. People farmed, traded, married, and worshipped with few interruptions. The fall of the Mamluk Sultanate came at the hands of the Ottoman Empire in the early 16th century. When the Ottomans took control of Gaza, they inherited a city that was tired but intact. The Mamluk legacy left behind institutions, architecture, and a civic rhythm that would continue under new rulers. To understand Gaza during the Mamluk era is to understand the city not at its peak, but in its survival. It was not the center of decisions or revolutions, but a witness to centuries of change. It stood as a reminder that history is not only written in victories, but also in quiet endurance. Children still went to madrasa. Traders still opened stalls in the dusty market square. Olive trees still gave fruit in the dry hills beyond the walls. And Gaza, surrounded by ancient stones and distant empires, remained. Not powerful, not poor, not forgotten. Just there, waiting, as it always had. Segment 4. The calm before collapse, the Ottoman quiet that faded. When the Ottoman Empire absorbed Gaza in the early 16th century, the city entered another long chapter of subtle shifts and quiet continuity. Unlike the dramatic takeovers of earlier centuries, the Ottoman conquest was relatively swift and bureaucratic. The Mamluks had weakened over time, and the Ottoman victory in 1516 at the Battle of Marj Dabik cemented the control over Syria and Palestine. Gaza, a peripheral town in the grand sweep of empire, passed hands without great resistance. Under Ottoman rule, Gaza was integrated into a sprawling imperial administration that stretched from the Balkans to Arabia. The empire's strength lay in its ability to maintain a relatively uniform system of governance across its vast territories. Gaza, though not a major city, became part of the Sanjak district of Jerusalem, which was itself governed by a bey appointed by the central authorities in Istanbul. Local leadership remained important. The Ottomans, practical in their imperial management, relied on local elites to govern day-to-day affairs. Prominent families, often with deep roots in a region, serve as intermediaries between the imperial authorities and the people. In Gaza, one such family was the Ridwans, who came to dominate regional politics for over a century. As governors or mutasarrifs, they maintained order, collected taxes, and oversaw basic infrastructure. The Ottoman administrative system, while hierarchical and centralized, also allowed for a degree of autonomy at the local level. This meant that while Gaza was subject to imperial edicts, it was often shaped by the personalities and policies of its local governors. Some were competent and fair, others corrupt and self-serving. As with much of the Ottoman Empire, the quality of governance in Gaza depended less on ideology and more on the competence of individual officials. Gaza's strategic value remained modest but real. It continued to serve as a stop along pilgrimage routes to Mecca and as a way station on trade routes between Egypt and the Levant. These functions sustained a steady, if unremarkable, flow of travelers, merchants, and clerics through the city. Inns, markets, and caravanserais benefited from this slow but continuous movement of people and goods. Religious life during this period was diverse but stable. The Ottoman millet system allowed non-Muslim communities to govern themselves in matters of religion and civil law. In Gaza, Muslims remained the majority, but Christians and Jews lived in small but persistent numbers. They paid the jizya tax and lived in designated quarters, practicing their faith with limited interference. Mosques were maintained and sometimes restored. Sufi lodges offered spiritual guidance and social services. Culturally, Gaza saw moments of vibrancy during this time. Some local poets, scholars, and jurists emerged and contributed to broader intellectual currents within the empire. Manuscripts were copied and traded. Religious debates played out quietly in madrasas and homes. Yet Gaza never rose to the stature of Damascus or Cairo. It remained provincial, more reflective than innovative. Economically, Gaza relied on agriculture and artisanal goods. Olive oil production remained vital, as did the soap industry. Wheat, barley, and fruits were cultivated in surrounding lands. While taxes were burdensome at times, especially under corrupt officials, the overall system allowed for subsistence and small-scale commerce to persist. Gaza was not wealthy, but neither was it destitute. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, Gaza enjoyed relative peace. The Ottoman military kept major threats at bay, and the region was largely spared from external invasions. This allowed generations of residents to grow up without the fear of sudden conquest. Children attended schools, trades passed from parent to child, and community rhythms settled into a steady pace. However, the limitations of this stability became more apparent over time. As the Ottoman Empire began to show signs of decline in the 18th century, so too did its peripheral provinces. Gaza experienced fewer investments from the central government. Infrastructure aged. Roads deteriorated. Administrative posts became more corrupt. The empire's vastness, once a strength, now meant that attention and resources were spread thin. By the late Ottoman period, Gaza's significance had faded even further. It was a quiet town not known for influence or rebellion, caught in a slow drift of neglect. And yet, the people of Gaza adapted. They continued their traditions. They celebrated weddings, mourned losses, and observed religious holidays with continuity that transcended politics. Local institutions, mosques, markets, family networks provided a structure that government increasingly failed to maintain. In this way, the Ottoman period in Gaza was one of quiet endurance. The city did not rise to prominence, nor did it collapse. It existed in the long shadow of empire, functioning well enough for life to go on. It held its place on maps, mentioned occasionally in reports or travelogues, but rarely demanding the spotlight. And sometimes, history moves most gently through such places. In the coming years, that gentleness would end. The 19th and early 20th centuries would bring modernization, European interests, wars, and mandates. But before all that, Gaza lived a long era of stillness under the slow ticking of Ottoman clocks. The story of Gaza in this time is not one of grand events, but of ordinary persistence. It is a story told in the quiet morning calls to prayer, the patient labor of soap makers, the careful record-keeping of scribes, and the rustle of leaves in olive groves. Gaza endured not by triumph, but by continuation. And that, too, is history worth remembering. During the height of Ottoman administration in Gaza, one of the most defining features of daily life was the quiet, layered cohabitation of faiths. While the broader empire was expansive and diverse, it was in provincial towns like Gaza that the theory of coexistence became real life. Under the millet system, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, not always in harmony, but in continuity. It was not a utopia, nor was it without its tensions. But Gaza in the 17th and 18th centuries reflected a world where faiths did not need to agree in order to coexist. The majority of Gaza's population remained Muslim, with mosques dotting the city's modest skyline. Call to prayer echoed from minarets 5 times a day, forming the background music to ordinary life. But nestled within the narrow streets were also Christian churches and Jewish synagogues, their bells and rituals quieter but persistent. These buildings were smaller, humbler, sometimes hidden behind high walls or tucked between homes. But they endured. For Christian and Jewish communities, life in Gaza was circumscribed by rules and limitations, but not by outright hostility. They paid special taxes, such as the jizya, which exempted them from military service but marked their position as dhimmi, protected but subordinate. These communities had their own leaders, typically appointed from among themselves, who managed internal affairs, settled disputes, and liaised with the Ottoman authorities. In Christian homes, one might find crosses carved quietly into wooden doorframes or painted icons hung in dim backrooms. Families gathered for prayers in Aramaic or Greek, depending on denomination. Religious feasts were celebrated privately, with special breads, incense, and chants that had been passed down for generations. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem remained a dream for many, and Gaza's proximity made it a spiritual threshold. Jewish families, smaller in number but deeply rooted, maintained traditions within close-knit quarters. The community's rhythms followed the Hebrew calendar, Sabbath evenings lit by oil lamps, prayers sung softly, bread baked in old stone ovens. Torah scrolls were stored carefully in wooden arks, and teachings were passed orally, especially when access to rabbis or formal yeshivas was limited. Children learned prayers from elders, and weddings were conducted under chuppas fashioned in small courtyards. Muslim majority life, of course, framed the city. Fridays were especially vibrant. Markets swelled before noon, then stilled as men headed to mosques. Sermons, often focusing on morality and importance of justice, were heard not just by congregants but by the wider neighborhood through open doors and quiet listeners. Sufi mystics also played a role, providing spiritual guidance and maintaining lodges where music, poetry, and hospitality were offered. Relations between communities were guided less by philosophical agreement and more by pragmatism. Butchers sold meat to anyone, provided it met basic ritual expectations. Water carriers, carpenters, potters, and tailors served a mixed clientele. Disputes arose, as they always do in human affairs. But they were usually settled through a blend of local custom and religious law, each community handling its own internal cases and appealing to Ottoman courts only when absolutely necessary. There were, of course, lines that were not crossed. Conversions were rare and sensitive. Intermarriage between faiths was practically unheard of, discouraged by all sides. Religious festivals were not public spectacles, but there was a mutual understanding of boundaries. This was not pluralism as celebrated in modern ideals, but functional coexistence that allowed for continuity, stability, and cautious respect. One could imagine the streets of Gaza during this time. Narrow, worn smooth by centuries of sandals and wheels, lined with stone homes shaded by wooden awnings. Children from different communities played together, then drifted apart at sundown to return to their particular ways. Candles glowed in windows. From behind closed doors came the sound of prayers, some in Arabic, others in Hebrew, and still others in Greek or Armenian. This coexistence was helped, in part, by the shared rhythms of survival. All communities faced the same droughts, the same price hikes in grain, the same storms that battered the coast. They stood in the same market lines, heard the same news from travelers, and waited for the same caravan shipments. In these daily needs, faith was often secondary to circumstance. At times, the equilibrium was shaken. A new governor might raise taxes unfairly on one community. A false accusation could spark unrest. Rumors from Jerusalem or Cairo might ripple southward, stirring fear or resentment. But these moments were generally short-lived. Gaza's population, seasoned by centuries of change, leaned toward caution and continuity. Religious life was also tied to geography. Gaza's proximity to Jerusalem meant that it remained a spiritual waypoint. Pilgrims passed through the city, staying in small inns, often sharing stories and scriptures. Some left behind donations or scrolls. Others lingered, adding to the city's quiet diversity. Shrines and sacred wells dotted the region, drawing both the devout and the curious. Through all of this, Gaza remained relatively obscure on the imperial stage. Its peaceful coexistence did not merit attention in Istanbul, and its minor tensions did not threaten empire-wide harmony. It was, to the Ottomans, a reliable district, quiet, tax-paying, unrebellious. And for its residents, that relative anonymity was often a blessing. So Gaza's religious coexistence, however imperfect, stretched across generations. Families remembered stories from centuries before of crusades, of Saladin of far-off empires, and measured their own lives in terms of how peacefully they could plant, marry, teach, and pray. They knew the world could change quickly, but for the time being, faith stood beside one another, each with its lamp lit. This, too, is a part of Gaza's history. Not conquest, not collapse, but a gentle holding on. Not loud, not triumphant, but enduring. And in the soft glow of twilight, when the day's final prayers rose into warm air, there was a kind of harmony, unwritten, uncelebrated, but undeniably present. In the calm shadow of empire, long after the echoes of crusades and conquests have faded, Gaza found its rhythm again, not through conquest or ceremony, but through commerce. Modest, domestic, quietly persistent commerce. Trade did not make Gaza rich, but it made it resilient. It stitched the city into a wider economic world, where goods moved slower than news, and prosperity came in bars of soap and bolts of cloth rather than sacks of silver. Gaza's economy during the Ottoman period relied heavily on agriculture, but it was commerce, particularly in textiles and soap, that offered a degree of identity and influence. These goods, though simple, formed the lifeblood of its markets and supported generations of craftsmen, merchants, and traders. Gaza's geographical position, along caravan routes and coastal access, allowed its goods to travel farther than many of its people ever would. Textiles were among the most important industries in Ottoman Gaza. Cotton was grown in nearby fields and brought into town, where it was cleaned, spun, dyed, and woven into cloth. The production process involved entire families and neighborhoods. Children helping to card fibers, women spinning and dyeing threads, and men weaving or trading finished boats. Much of the production remained on a cottage industry scale, but few workshops gained local renown. Dyes were made from plants, roots, and minerals, often ground and mixed according to recipes passed down through generations. Indigo, madder, and saffron yielded blues, reds, and golden hues. The fabrics produced range from coarse everyday cloth to fine garments reserved for wealthier clients or religious use. Gaza's textiles, while not famous across the empire, were respected for their practicality, subtle beauty, and durability. Markets were the nerve centers of this trade. Stalls lined the central square, overflowing with folded fabric, wool, spindles of thread, and dyes wrapped in paper or cloth. Buyers came from neighboring villages, from caravans, and occasionally from further afield. Haggling was expected. Relationships were key, and transactions were recorded in simple ledgers or memorized by heart. Yet it was Gaza's soap that came to symbolize the city's industrious spirit. Olive trees, abundant in the surrounding countryside, provided the raw material for this essential good. Olives were pressed for oil, which was then heated, mixed with lye and water, and poured into large vats. The mixture simmered slowly over wood fires, tended by workers who watched it carefully for texture and clarity. Once ready, the soap was poured into shallow wooden frames, allowed to cool and harden, and then cut into rectangular bars. These bars were stacked in airy storerooms and left to cure, sometimes for months, before being wrapped in cloth or paper and sold. The scent was earthy, clean, and faintly fruity. Soap from Gaza was prized not just for its quality, but for its longevity. Soap making was an art, but also a communal effort. Fathers passed down techniques to sons. Entire city blocks might share ovens and storerooms. The success of one batch could lift many families. Local pride centered not on grand buildings or political power, but on the feel of smooth cloth, the scent of new soap, and the knowledge that someone in Damascus or Beirut might one day wash with something born in Gaza's quiet quarters. Trade routes carried these goods outward. Camel caravans trudged steadily across dry hills toward Hebron, Jerusalem, and Nablus. Some made it all the way to Aleppo or Cairo, their loads jostling with boats of fabric and baskets of soap. Coastal traders occasionally loaded wares onto small vessels headed for ports in Sidon, Acre, or even Alexandria. Gaza was not a major hub, but it played its part, one thread in a much larger tapestry. And commerce did more than move goods. It moved people. Merchants traveled. Journeymen visited new towns. Buyers and sellers exchanged news, stories, and ideas. A traveler passing through might learn not only the price of wheat in Jerusalem, but hear gossip from Istanbul or theological arguments from Damascus. Trade, in its own quiet way, kept Gaza connected. The economy remained modest. Few grew wealthy. Most people lived on the edge of sufficiency, earning enough to survive, sometimes enough to save, rarely enough to indulge. But there was a dignity in the work. It required skill, discipline, patience. And it gave people a reason to wake before dawn, to light their fires, to walk the market with hope and pride. Local governance played a role in supporting this economy, sometimes by maintaining order, more often by not interfering. Officials collected taxes, regulated weights and measures, and issued trade permits. Corruption was a reality, but it was often seen as a necessary tax rather than a catastrophic burden. When a governor was fair, merchants prospered. When a governor was greedy, they adjusted quietly until he was replaced. Women participated, especially in textile production. They spun thread in courtyards, dyed fabric in clay pots, and helped manage stalls. Some women ran small home-based businesses, bartering or selling to neighbors. Though their names were rarely recorded, their hands shaped the goods that traveled far beyond Gaza's walls. Markets brought life to the city. They pulsed with sound and scent. Carts creaking, chickens clucking, the tang of olives, the sweetness of fruit. Merchants called out to passers-by. Customers fingered fabric and debated prices. Children darted between stalls. Elders watched from shaded benches. These scenes repeated daily, weekly, seasonally, forming the living calendar of a city. And through all this, Gaza remained quiet in the larger imperial consciousness. It paid its dues, caused no trouble, sent no envoys, waged no wars. It existed in the economic shadow of larger cities, but not in isolation. It was part of the long chain of movement and making that sustained the Ottoman world. Looking back, this period may seem unremarkable, but for those who lived it, it was everything. It was how families survived, how skills are preserved, how dignity was earned. Gaza's soap and textiles did not change empires, but they changed lives, softly, steadily, bar by bar, thread by thread. And that, too, is a history worth telling. While Gaza never claimed the architectural majesty of Jerusalem or the intellectual prestige of Cairo, it had something just as enduring, a quiet reputation among those who traveled far and wrote deeply. During the Ottoman centuries, it became a place not only of modest trade and coexistence, but also of passing insight, a resting place for the weary, a waypoint for pilgrims, and a muse for poets whose names may have faded, but whose words left impressions like soft footprints in coastal sand. The city's geographical location made it a natural resting point for pilgrims on their way to Mecca, Jerusalem, or even Mount Sinai. Long caravans would pass through, some pausing for days, others for hours. Pilgrims, dressed in humble garb and carrying few possessions, found in Gaza a place of water, prayer, and reflection. Local families would open their doors, offering simple meals, lentils, bread, olive oil, and perhaps a place on a rooftop for a night's rest. For those traveling to Jerusalem, Gaza was one of the last southern cities where one could prepare spiritually, logistically, and emotionally. It was said that some pilgrims, upon arriving, would walk the city's perimeter barefoot, whispering blessings or offering thanks for safe passage so far. Mosques would host travelers with extended sermons, and market stalls sold charms, dates, and cloths marked with prayers. But it wasn't just pilgrims who stopped. Scholars from Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo occasionally passed through. Some came for quiet retreat, others to visit a teacher or review manuscripts housed in a small madrasa library. A few stayed, leaving behind books that would remain untouched for generations. A short list of names, clerics, historians, legal scholars, is all that remains in some dusty records, but each points to a moment when Gaza became something more than a stopover. And poets, those restless scribes of silence, came too. Some were from Gaza itself. Others arrived, stayed for a season, and wrote verses that tried to capture the city's tone. The poetry was rarely grand or epic. Instead, it spoke of jasmine on windowsills, of the call to prayer echoing through morning fog, of women drawing water while humming to children strapped to their backs. One verse found in an 18th century manuscript described Gaza as the pause between questions, a line that speaks volumes even now. Coffee houses played a quiet but central role in this cultural flow. These were not the bustling cafes of Istanbul or Damascus, but shaded rooms with low tables and slow afternoons. Here, travelers told stories. Scribes read aloud. Locals debated theology or taxes. A poet might test a new verse. A merchant might recite a letter from his brother in Nablus. Time moved differently in such places. For women, too, there was quiet expression. Though rarely acknowledged in formal texts, oral storytelling thrived. Mothers taught daughters folk songs, lullabies, and tales of saints and spirits. These stories, passed down over generations, held truths not found in scrolls or official records. They spoke of longing, resilience, and sometimes gentle defiance. Pilgrimage transformed the city seasonally. During key months, especially before Hajj, Gaza swelled with bodies, sandals, livestock, and carts. Temporary markets sprung up, tents filled open courtyards, and the rhythm of the city shifted. Residents adapted, renting space, preparing food, or simply watching the flow. And when the travelers departed, they left traces. A coin, a story, a line of poetry carved on a wooden beam. The religious and cultural value of Gaza in these times was understated but present. A small shrine here, a scholar's grave there, manuscripts that bore stamps of distant libraries. Accounts from travelers, many now preserved in European archives, mention Gaza with phrases like pleasantly quiet, good bread, and wise old men. These may sound modest, but in a region scarred by upheaval, such descriptors were high praise. There were tensions, of course. At times, pilgrims brought not just stories but disputes. Travelers could be robbed, or mistrust between sects could briefly flare. But such moments were usually quelled by Gaza's natural gravity towards stillness. Its pace, its customs, its modesty, these acted as a balm. The city also had its scribes, record keepers, and calligraphers. Some produced legal documents. Others copied poetry. Occasionally, illuminated texts made their way into local collections, albeit rare. The work was slow, done by candlelight or morning sun, with ink that smelled of gum Arabic and effort. In some homes, these texts were wrapped in cloth and stored like family treasures. Gaza's poetry and prayer were rarely celebrated beyond its borders. But that may be the point. Its cultural history was never about proclamation. It was about presence, about what happens when people pause, when they reflect, when they pass through, not to conquer or collect, but to breathe and remember. In a sense, the poets and pilgrims of Gaza shaped its soul more than any governor or battle ever could. They carried its spirit outward, in songs and memory, in brief mentions in journals tucked between pages of legal accounts or trade records. Gaza, through them, became more than a dot on a map. It became an echo, and so it remains, waiting between arrivals, listening between departures, carrying verses no one wrote down, but everyone somehow remembers. This, too, is a history worth resting inside. By the final century of Ottoman rule, Gaza's long stretch of relative quiet began to waver. What had once been a sleepy provincial town, self-sufficient, gently devout, and humming with the modest rhythm of trade and tradition, began to show signs of fatigue. This erosion of stability was not a sudden collapse, but rather a slow unraveling. Threads of governance loosened, roads fell into disrepair, ambitions narrowed, and across the empire, Gaza was not alone. In the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the formidable power it once was. Wars on distant fronts drained the treasury. European powers loomed, economically and politically. Reforms, though attempted, often fell short in execution, and corruption proved more persistent than good intention. For towns like Gaza, caught far from the capital and far from the spotlight, these tremors translated into crumbling roads, neglected buildings, and fewer coins in the market. Local leadership weakened as the central administration became increasingly erratic. Governors changed often, some appointed by merit, others by bribery, few with lasting impact. The consistency that had once anchored Gaza's civic life faded, replaced by short-term rule and inconsistent policy. Taxes remained, of course, but what came in was less often reinvested. Infrastructure, repairs slowed. Maintenance of public wells and mosques became sporadic. Even the enforcement of law, long a source of quiet order, became unreliable. Trade, once the lifeblood of the town, suffered. Caravan routes shifted. Coastal ports further north or south became more attractive to larger merchants. The expansion of steamship commerce and railway development elsewhere bypassed Gaza entirely. This was a critical missed opportunity. Goods moved faster, farther, just not through Gaza. Local industries, such as soap making and textile production, face increased competition from imported goods. While some families held on, others closed shop. Daily life began to reflect this decline. Markets still opened, but with fewer stalls. Fewer travelers passed through. Some families migrated northward, seeking opportunity in Jaffa or Jerusalem. The youth, who once inherited their father's shops or trade secrets, increasingly looked outward or left altogether. What remained was a population aging in place, doing their best to preserve dignity amid shrinking horizons. Religious life, once a bastion of Gaza's identity, remained strong but quieted. Shrines and mosques still drew devout, but upkeep waned. Christian and Jewish populations, already small, became smaller. The millet system, once a framework for coexistence, became more administrative than cultural. Coexistence persisted, but without vitality. Where once people had leaned across boundaries, now they stood politely beside them. Education, too, began to suffer. Where Gaza had maintained small schools, madrasas, and study circles, these institutions faltered as funding dwindled. Teachers went unpaid. Books grew old and unreplaceable. The few scholars who remained became caretakers of memory, rather than pioneers of new thought. Knowledge survived, but it no longer grew. Foreign influence increased as Ottoman control weakened. European consuls began to appear in nearby towns. Missionary schools offered Western education, medicine, and aid, but also skepticism toward Ottoman governance. While these efforts brought some improvements, They also planted seeds of division, as local identity began to blur with external agendas. By the final decade of Ottoman control, Gaza's atmosphere had changed. Where once there had been quiet purpose, now there was waiting for news, for change, for clarity. Yet it rarely came. The First World War loomed just over the horizon. Rumors of military conscription, famine, and territorial shifts reached Gaza in fragments. Families hoarded food. Some dug wells deeper. Others simply waited. What held the city together in these years was not the strength of institutions, but the endurance of habit. People prayed. They baked bread. They repaired roofs as best they could. Children still learned to read, if not from teachers, then from grandparents. Life continued, but it did so under the weight of uncertainty. In many ways, this period marked the end of an old world, a world where Gaza had existed largely in the spaces between events, a world defined not by spectacle, but by continuity. That continuity was now fraying. A century of being overlooked had preserved the city from many storms, but it also left it unprepared when the winds finally turned. So, by the time Ottoman soldiers began retreating and British forces approached during the First World War, Gaza was no longer a town of thriving industry or spirited pluralism. It was a town still breathing, but shallowly, a town with memories longer than its future felt. But even in decline, Gaza did not vanish. Its streets still bore the footprints of centuries. Its homes still echoed with prayer, and its people, tired yet remained rooted. That, too, is part of the story. The story of how cities fade not in fire, but in quiet, not in collapse, but in exhaustion, and how, even then, they endure. Conclusion. In the centuries that followed, the silence that once pervaded Gaza gave way to the crackle of gunfire and the smoke of endless war. What had once faded into a violent awakening. From British orders to partition plans, from the Nakba to blockades, the 20th century stripped Gaza of its innocence. The ancient rhythms, markets opening at dawn, soap stored in shaded rooms, pilgrims whispering prayers, were replaced by sirens, barracks, and headlines that forgot stories buried in sand. Palestine was no longer a place in the world's imagination, but a problem, a conflict, a wound, debated and ignored in equal measure. And Gaza, once a way station for weary travelers and quiet poets, became a cage of concrete and memory. The empires that once ruled here were gone. Scrolls and caravans, mosaics and manuscripts, all are overshadowed by smoke and rubble. Yet in all this, the sadness lies not just in the suffering, but also in forgetting that before the headlines and the airstrikes, there was a Gaza of gardens and scrolls and songs. A land that once breathed softly, even when no one was watching. Perhaps one day it will return. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.